Chapter 121, Decision 2. Luke arrived at a bar that was far from the center of Jericho. The building had a worn-out wooden facade, with 2 swinging doors, the classic kind from old western saloons. Barely hanging from their rusty hinges, a faint light filtered through the dirty windows, signaling that the place was open. Am I in the Wild West? Luke thought as he walked toward the entrance. He pushed the doors, which creaked loudly. Upon entering, he could see the inside of the bar. It wasn't huge. The floor was made of old wood that creaked underfoot. There were a couple of dirty circular tables with their respective chairs. Only one table was being used by 5 people who were playing poker, smoking and drinking alcohol. At the very back was the bar with stools to sit on and order a drink from the bartender, who was wiping a glass with a rag that seemed to be making it dirtier rather than cleaning it. The 6 adults, with their fierce looks and outcast appearances, turned their heads and looked at Luke. They thought they'd find some of their late-arriving colleagues, but instead, they saw a kid who could have been anyone's son. Luke kept a stoic expression as he walked steadily toward the bar. Sitting on a stool, he raised some dust and looked at the bartender, who had frozen in place, staring at him with a confused expression. The others were just as confused, so they had fallen silent. What was a high school kid doing in this bar so far from the center of Jericho? A little sake, Luke said, breaking the silence and tapping the bar as he got lost in his thoughts. We don't serve brats here. Go back to your parents, the bartender growled, his voice rough and raspy. It would be bad for his rundown bar to get into trouble with the authorities because a teenager showed up there. Aren't you that writer? A bald man, who had started to get up from his chair and walk toward Luke, fell unconscious before he could finish his sentence. Sleep, Luke thought. The other 4 men at the table fell asleep in their seats. The bartender was startled by this, but before he could react, he realized he was losing control over his body and thoughts. Sake, Luke repeated. Of course he was using mind control on these normies. I don't have sake. I can offer you whiskey, rum, tequila or vodka, the bartender replied in a monotone voice, his gaze blank. What do you recommend, old man? Luke asked, looking at Edgar, who was floating beside him. Vodka, Edgar answered without hesitation. I'm surprised you haven't tried alcohol until now, Edgar added, shaking his head. He had witnessed several invitations to secret parties at Nevermore that Luke had turned down. Do you want me to get drunk and be an easier target to kill? I would have been an easy target for Sabrina last year, Luke said. Whatever, just order the vodka, Edgar replied, and Luke ordered it from the bartender, who placed small shot glasses in a horizontal line. Then he took out a glass bottle with a clear liquid and poured the vodka into each of the small glasses. After serving the alcohol, the bartender stood still, saying nothing, waiting for Luke's orders as he stared at the shot glasses. Luke picked one up and drank it. He tasted the vodka. A very bad idea. A look of disgust appeared on his face, making Edgar laugh. Don't taste the vodka, it's probably cheap, so it must have a stronger taste, Edgar said, laughing. You could have said that earlier. How many of these will it take to get me drunk? Luke asked curiously. He had never been drunk in his life. He didn't know what the effect would be like. As an outcast, you're more resistant to alcohol, but you're not immune. It's hard to say for sure. Just keep drinking, Edgar responded, and Luke continued drinking vodka in silence, while in his mind he had a major debate, Wednesday or Enid. That's the question. Polygamy isn't an option for several reasons. First, Luke wouldn't like having 2 girlfriends. It would be strange for him, and he wouldn't be able to handle taking care of 2. Second, there's Enid and Wednesday. Luke is almost certain that neither of the 2 girls would accept polygamy. Enid is jealous and territorial. She's shown that many times. As for Wednesday, although she hasn't openly shown jealousy, she has expressed some anger toward the promise Luke has with Enid. Besides, Wednesday is a narcissist. Luke thinks her narcissism surpasses his own. She would never accept sharing anything or anyone. She grew up with 2 loving parents who have a monogamous relationship. After all, polygamy in the outcast society is used for offspring, not for true love. They're not living in a high school romance harem. While thinking about these things, he finished all the vodka-filled shot glasses. He glanced at the shelf full of alcohol bottles. A bottle labeled whiskey caught his attention. With a slight motion of his hand, one of the small glasses disappeared, replaced by the whiskey bottle. A shambles, a very convenient technique, Luke thought with a satisfied smile as he looked at the whiskey bottle in front of him. He never thought he could replicate the shambles technique used by Law in One Piece. To replicate this technique, Luke used his white and yellow aura. By expanding his domain, Luke essentially replicates Law's room. He can sense the presence of others and objects even without seeing them with his eyes. Once his domain is expanded, he uses a technique called clairvoyant sensitivity. This is the primary technique of clairvoyance, which gives him the ability to feel the texture of objects he examines, even probing them to identify the material of the object. He must choose two objects using this technique, allowing him to have precise control over the space and the two objects he selected. The final step is to use telekinesis for the exchange of positions between objects. With a clear understanding of the layout, thanks to clairvoyance, he can instantly move an object from its current location to a new one, while the object in the other position moves to the original spot. This is also applicable to humans. Luke had used this technique to dodge Atlas's final charge by swapping places with a small leaf. Now he had his teleportation technique, although he still needed more practice for it to feel like actual teleportation. With his 20-kilometer domain, he could potentially teleport over great distances in the future, but it's more difficult when the objects are farther apart. Just as Luke was about to grab the bottle to pour himself some shots of whiskey, a hairy hand beat him to it. Confused, he looked at the bartender, who was now moving on his own, even though Luke hadn't given him any orders. The bartender was a burly man with a large belly, he had a scruffy beard, and his hands were hairy. The bartender opened the bottle with surprising skill, and as he did, Luke felt a familiar presence. The man's voice sounded more firm and confident than he remembered. "I see you're divided, caught between two dilemmas," said the bartender with a crooked smile as he filled Luke's glass. Did my mind control wear off? Luke thought. He instantly noticed that the chatty ghost of his grandfather had vanished. An idea crossed his mind. Could Edgar be controlling the bartender? "I didn't know you could control normies. Feels like something out of The Exorcist," Luke commented. Edgar, in the bartender's body, poured Luke a drink and took one for himself. An old-school trick. "Kid, and speaking of that, let's get back to the point. You're over-complicating this whole love thing. It's more complicated than you think," Luke said with a sigh. Edgar, still in the bartender's body, raised an eyebrow as he poured himself another drink, a mischievous smile on his face. "Here's my first piece of advice. Why limit yourself to choosing between one or the other? If you like both, why not keep both?" he said, bringing the glass to his lips without hesitation. "The Poe family will thrive if you have two such talented wives. A pure lineage of a werewolf and a talented psychic like you who possesses two auras. You could convince them if they both like you. Don't get stuck in a decision that has an easy solution," Edgar added with a playful grin. "I know what you're trying to do, old man, but I hate to break it to you. That's not going to work. So thanks, but no, I don't want two girlfriends. That's just not for me," Luke said, taking the glass and tasting the whiskey for the first time. Once he finished, he gestured for Edgar to pour him another. Edgar let out a hearty laugh but didn't seem bothered. "I see I won't convince you to take that route. Fine, if that's what you want," he said with a shrug, pouring himself another drink and refilling Luke's glass. "Now if we're discarding that option, the question is, which one are you going to choose? I think the answer is pretty obvious, don't you?" Luke leaned back in his seat, pretending to focus deeply, placing his hands on his forehead in an exaggerated gesture, as if trying to read Edgar's mind. "Let me guess your thoughts," he said theatrically. "You want me to choose Wednesday, right?" Edgar nodded with a smile, amused by his great-great-grandson's little performance. Luke slapped the bar, satisfied with himself. "I didn't even have to use my blue aura. Maybe I should become a fortune teller," he joked before downing another shot of whiskey. It seemed the alcohol was already affecting his behavior. Edgar laughed at Luke's antics and poured more whiskey into both of their glasses. "Wednesday understands you better than anyone, you know that. She's like you. You're not afraid of her, and she's not afraid of you. With her, you can be yourself. Always," Edgar said. Luke set the glass down on the bar, staring at the golden liquid. Edgar was right, and he knew it. With Enid, he had always been afraid to show his darker side, so to speak. Though he didn't really think of it as that dark, he was only like that with his enemies. It's not like he was a psychopath or a serial killer. With Wednesday, I don't have to pretend. She accepts me as I am, darkness and all. But Enid, she showed me a side of myself I didn't know. She made me feel more human, I guess," Luke said, slowly turning the glass in his hands. Edgar tilted his head, his gaze becoming more inquisitive. "And which side do you prefer, Luke? The one that embraces you for who you are, or the one that forces you to be something you may not be able to maintain?" Luke frowned. He remembered the scared look in Enid's eyes on the night of the lunar eclipse. At that moment, he felt like a bond between them had broken. Enid had taken a couple of days to contact him again, perhaps thinking of cancelling their promise or something similar. Enid had been his first crush, the first person who made him feel something beyond the loneliness that had always surrounded him. That's why it was so hard for him to let her go, but deep down he knew something had changed between them. something he couldn't fix. He couldn't forget the way she looked at him that night with fear, as if he was something dangerous. The decision is made, Luke thought firmly, downing the glass in one swift motion. His expression returned to normal, free from the earlier worry in that moment. He felt as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, a release that brought unexpected relief. It looks like you've made a decision, Edgar said, watching Luke's face. Yeah, want to know what it is? Luke asked with a slight smile, knowing that Edgar was dying of curiosity. No need, I'll see it on the front page soon enough, Edgar replied, shaking his head. He didn't know exactly what decision Luke had made, but whatever it was, Edgar would be fine with it. He only wanted to help his descendant. Of course, Edgar had a more favorable opinion of Wednesday. But he had been honest in their conversation. He hadn't just thought about the Poe lineage or the optimal resurgence of their fallen family. He had given his honest opinion. He had observed Luke with both Enid and Wednesday, and he believed his descendant was happier and more genuine with the Gothic girl. Thanks for the talk, Luke said with some difficulty. This conversation had been very good for him. It's nothing. Luckily, we managed to solve the problem before this body reached its limit, Edgar said as he exited the normie's body, which had turned a sickly pale colour. The bartender collapsed to the floor, his face resembling that of a terminal patient, trembling. Hey, don't bring me any more problems, Luke thought, peering over the bar to check on the bartender. The best thing to do was to get out quickly, after erasing the memories of these normies. Chapter 122, Decision 3, Wednesday Adams calmly opened her eyes, just like every other morning. It's today, that was her first thought, as she robotically got out of bed and checked the time, 6 in the morning. There was still an hour and a half before the first class period started. She had woken up earlier than usual. Normally, she woke up at 6:30 am. The reason for this change was a thought that had been lingering in her mind for almost 2 days, a thought about Luke and the decision he would make. Would he keep his promise and return to Enid? Or would he choose her? The answer should be obvious. She was better than Enid in every way. Why would Luke hesitate in his choice? Just thinking about these things annoyed her. What annoyed her even more was that she was getting angry and affected by her emotions. She only has an advantage because she got there first, Wednesday told herself, glancing at Enid, who was still sleeping in the other bed in their dorm room. After staring at her silently for several seconds, she looked away and began her morning routine. She hadn't managed to befriend her roommate, and the only friend she had made was Eugene, whom she saw as a younger brother. The school year was almost over, that's what she was waiting for. The only unusual thing was Luke. Even with Enid, their relationship had stagnated lately. And the usually cheerful girl had stopped trying to befriend her. The reason was obvious. 30 minutes before classes started, Enid woke up. She and Wednesday exchanged glances, but neither said a word. They continued with their own routines in silence. There was an invisible tension in the room. Each of them went to class on their own. Wednesday was distracted throughout the entire class. The lessons were tedious, as the final exams were approaching, but this had never happened to her before. Her eyes kept drifting toward the round clock and then to Luke, who was sitting about 3 desks away, looking sleepy as always. He must have stayed up all night, though today it's much worse than usual, Wednesday thought, examining Luke's face. Luke was experiencing his first hangover, a headache, drowsiness, and having to listen to a teacher talk about boring things. It was too much. He shouldn't have had so much vodka and whiskey the night before. He had overestimated his outcast metabolism. If she thought about it, that's one of the few differences she had with Luke. She had a routine every day. Luke, on the other hand, wasn't the type to structure his days. However, she liked staying up late. She was a night person, but during the school period she changed her routine to optimize her time. During vacations she returned to her nocturnal habits. At noon, they had a long break that lasted an hour. All the students headed to the cafeteria to buy lunch and eat there. Wednesday noticed that Luke was heading in a different direction. He didn't go to the cafeteria. Enid also wasn't there, eating lunch with her friends. They must be talking about the promise, Wednesday easily deduced. Her expression remained the same, as she ate slowly. But she felt something strange inside. Was this nerves? Was she feeling nervous for the first time? Luke found himself standing in front of Enid in a deserted hallway where almost no students ever passed by. Since she had defeated the Hyde, Luke told her the whole truth about why he ended their relationship. On one hand, it was because of his enemies, who could use her as a hostage again and threaten him. However, the key reason for Luke's decision was Enid's mother. Esther had pushed Luke to break up with Enid. Luke told her exactly what Esther had said, this time. She's crossed the line, Enid said, frowning, staring at the floor deep in thought, her fists clenched. She couldn't believe her mother would meddle so much in her affairs. The hallway fell silent as Enid thought until she lifted her gaze and her eyes met Luke's. So I was right, you left me because of your enemies, although I didn't know about my mother, Enid said. Yes, Luke replied, nodding. So we should get back, Unc, Enid added in a low voice, avoiding eye contact with Luke. You don't sound very sure, Luke said. And Enid abruptly lifted her head to look at him. That's not it, she quickly said, raising her hands and gesturing wildly. It's just that so much has happened since the promise. My feelings are a mess right now. It's okay, Enid, Luke interrupted, hoping to stop her from justifying herself further. He wasn't upset with her. I won't be keeping the promise, Luke said, getting straight to the point. He had always been a direct person. There was no point in dragging things out. What, why? Enid asked, confused. Is it because of Wednesday? She asked again, not giving Luke a chance to answer the first question. I won't deny she's part of it, but she's not the main reason, Luke answered honestly. Then what is it? I don't want my girlfriend to look at me with fear, Luke replied bluntly. That was the reason he wouldn't keep his promise to Enid. It was true that he had fallen for Wednesday, but even if the goth girl hadn't been there, Luke would have come to the same conclusion. He didn't want the person he loved to be afraid of any part of his personality, though Wednesday's arrival had made it easier for him to let Enid go and reach that realization. It wasn't my intention. I was shocked when I saw Sabrina, and then when you killed her like that, Enid said, looking down, recalling the night of the lunar eclipse. I don't blame you. Everyone has their own values and limits of what they can handle, Luke said with a slightly strange expression. He was only being this understanding because it was Enid. I can change. I've always been sensitive to these things. If my brothers and the other outcasts can handle it, I can too, if it's for you, Enid said, her eyes brimming with tears that could spill at any moment. Though, Enid, that wouldn't be right. There's nothing wrong with you being the way you are and me being the way I am. We just don't match. I would kill my enemies without hesitation, while you would forgive them like you did with the Hyde, Luke said, shaking his head. For Enid to change would be difficult, and it would only prolong the relationship a bit longer than expected. Another example was when Enid wanted Wednesday not to kill Rowan. Despite witnessing Rowan trying to kill her, Luke wouldn't even hesitate against such enemies. He would kill anyone who tried to kill him, even if they weren't part of the Spellmans. Wednesday was the same, and many veteran outcasts thought that way. The new generation was different, maybe because of how closely connected they were to the normie society through technology and social media. And besides, I like Wednesday now, Luke said with tremendous difficulty. He wanted to make things clear. He didn't want Enid to find out later about his relationship with Wednesday, if they ever officially started dating. I'm sorry for deceiving you, it wasn't something I could control. Despite our promise, Luke said, sincerely apologizing, his plan wasn't to fall in love with Wednesday while he had the promise with Enid. It just happened. What Luke didn't realize was that this was the last straw for Enid. So I trained like crazy for nothing. I fought to the death against a drugged-up Hyde for nothing, Enid said, her frown deepening as her voice grew louder. And while I was giving it my all, you were falling in love with Wednesday Addams, she yelled in fury, grabbing Luke's tie with immense strength and yanking him roughly toward her. Luke looked at Enid, her face just inches from his. Her expression was pure rage and her grip was powerful. He had never seen her so angry, and she wasn't wrong. He had no excuses for her accusations. Everything she said was true. He had kissed Wednesday for the first time while Enid was just a door away, and then he continued seeing the goth girl, occasionally kissing her, all while the promise was still in effect. Answer me, Luke, Enid demanded, her voice trembling with fury, pulling him even closer until he was practically suffocating. What do you want me to say? I've already apologized. I can't change the past, Luke said in a calm tone, looking Enid straight in the eyes. At least you got your werewolf transformation much earlier. You won't be an outcast in your packs, Luke added. He had always known this was a big concern for Enid. She feared being exiled from her pack and cared deeply about others' opinions, especially her mother's. Now she no longer had to worry about that. She'd be considered a prodigy. Enid let go of the tie abruptly, but the fury in her eyes remained. Before Luke could say anything else, she slapped him, the sound of her palm echoing against his cheek. You're a damn bastard, Enid shouted, her voice a mix of rage and pain. I deserved that, Luke thought, feeling the sting on his cheek. How could you fall in love with someone else while I was doing all of this for us? Enid asked, her multicolored nails transforming into sharp claws. Okay, it won't go that far, right? Luke thought, eyeing the claws cautiously. He didn't want his face to be scarred. People don't choose when to fall in love, it just happens. It wasn't my intention, it just happened. Luke repeated what he had said earlier. Besides, the main reason he chose Wednesday was that she accepted him for who he truly was, and didn't look at him with fear like Enid had on the night of the blood moon. You're a bastard and a womanizer who doesn't keep his word. Luke, Enid said in a whisper, her voice filled with a mix of disappointment, sadness and anger. Luke frowned, hurt by her words. Maybe I am, he said calmly. He knew who he was, and although it pained him to have hurt her, he had already apologized sincerely. Enid stood in silence, her fists trembling with anger. I wish I had never met you, she finally said, her voice breaking. She turned and quickly walked away. Luke watched her back until she disappeared from sight. Then he sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, and sighed. Damn it, it's better to just train and play video games, he muttered. The day wasn't even over yet. He still had his talk with Wednesday. Would the gothic girl agree to be his official girlfriend? From their last conversation in the cafeteria, it seemed like she was willing, but it was hard to read her expression. If she rejects me, I'll be alone. Well, maybe that's for the best, Luke thought as he stood up and walked toward his next task. Luckily, his next class was psychic powers, so he didn't run into Enid. The odd thing was that in that class, he sat next to Wednesday. Both stayed silent, listening to the professor's lesson. They worked on the assignment together, but without discussing anything else. When the class ended, they had a short 10-minute break. Then another hour-long class, and during the break they headed to a place where they could talk without being disturbed. It was already 2:15 in the afternoon, which meant 48 hours had passed. In less than 10 minutes the last class starts. Let's finish this quickly, Wednesday said, stopping in a dimly lit hallway and staring intently at Luke. She tried to sound as indifferent as usual, but she was eager to hear Luke's answer. She had been distracted all day, and finally, after this, she could return to normal, although Luke didn't know this, since it was very difficult to tell if Wednesday was affected by anything or not. My relationship with Enid is over. I cancelled the promise, Luke said, making a dismissive gesture with his hand as if downplaying its importance. He, too, wanted to appear as indifferent as possible. Is it really over, or are you going to make another promise? Wednesday asked, raising an eyebrow. She felt the nerves she had been experiencing slowly start to fade. It's definitely over. I think this might give you a clue, Luke replied, pointing to his right cheek, which was still red from the slap Enid had given him a few hours earlier. She hit him, Wednesday thought, frowning slightly as she noticed Luke's reddened cheek. She felt relieved by his response but also a little angry. After that, both of them fell silent, just staring at each other. Neither knew how to proceed. So what now? Wednesday asked, breaking the silence. I don't know. Do we just go back to how things were? Luke asked. How they were? Wednesday questioned. You know, kissing and stuff, Luke replied with an awkward expression. Vulnerability was something he wasn't good at, and the idea of expressing himself felt almost insulting. He'd already gone through enough with Enid just recently. Should he ask Wednesday to start dating him officially? Of course he wasn't going to do that. It would only earn him her mockery, and he didn't want that either. Be more specific, Wednesday said. Why do I always have to be the one to clarify things? If you want something specific, then say it yourself, Luke complained. Normal acquaintances don't go around kissing and doing that stuff, Wednesday replied, mimicking Luke's tone in the last words. Respond, but don't mock me, Luke thought, rolling his eyes. A relationship, I guess, Luke finally said, and Wednesday nodded. Are you okay with that? I thought you hated anything considered normal, Luke said, noticing her agreement. I don't hate it. Couples who constantly fight and need to reaffirm their love every minute seem pathetic to me, Wednesday replied. Her disdain was clear, but there was more in her words, a subtle critique of the emotional dependency she observed in typical relationships. Luke couldn't agree more, and that whole thing of being glued together all the time, like they're Siamese twins. I don't know how they can stand that lack of independence, Wednesday added with a slight grimace of disgust. True, we should set some rules, so we don't end up doing those stupid things, Luke agreed. Both of them were loners who enjoyed their solitude. Neither wanted to be together 24/7. We will, but we'll discuss it later. We need to get back to class, Wednesday said, and they both started walking toward the classroom in silence, a comfortable silence, with no need for words. One more thing, she added as they walked without stopping. What? The relationship is monogamous, Wednesday replied, her tone not one of a request but a clarification. Yeah, sure, Luke said, initially not giving it much importance. But then, catching the meaning of her statement, he paused for a second and understood that any deviation from that expectation would be unforgivable. Though both were too proud to admit it, there was a mutual instinct of possession. They wouldn't accept sharing with anyone else. They continued walking, not saying anything more. They both understood the rules without the need for additional words. Chapter 123. The True Patriarch. Elliot Spellman, the current patriarch of the ancient and powerful psychic family, knelt with sweat on his forehead. Staring intently at the stone floor, a few meters ahead, ascending a set of steps, was a figure seated on an old-looking throne. Due to the dim lighting in the room, the person's face was barely visible. Their eyes were light blue, and they gazed at Elliot with disdain. "A mission," said the figure seated on the throne, breaking the oppressive silence of the room. His voice echoed, monotone and totally devoid of emotion. "You only had to complete one mission, and you failed. Not only that, but your daughter and son died. Your most loyal servant met the same fate. On top of that, the family suffered a major blow because Luke Poe gathered undeniable evidence, and you didn't even notice it." The figure continued. Their tone sounded neither angry nor mocking. It expressed no emotion at all. "I'm terribly sorry, Patriarch Edward," exclaimed Elliot, his voice filled with respect and fear toward the figure on the throne. He forcefully struck his head against the cold cobblestone floor. The dull thud echoed through the room, and a bit of blood trickled from Elliot's forehead, staining the floor. For most outcasts, it would be strange to see Elliot calling someone else patriarch, when he is the head of the Spellman family. Even more shocking would be hearing the name Elliot had spoken. The name Elliot said was Edward Spellman, a man who's for the entire outcast community should be dead. However, he is the true leader of the Spellman family, controlling everything from the shadows. "I told you it was a priority to eliminate Luke Poe, but you failed spectacularly, and the boy's still breathing. You launched a large-scale attack on Nevermore. I know I said the consequences didn't matter, but I didn't expect an attack of this magnitude." "Why?" asked Edward. "In the end, it would have been more effective for Atlas and the others to conduct a nighttime raid on Nevermore targeting Luke, or to ambush him when he left Nevermore. They might have been discovered and implicated innocents, whether normies or outcasts, yes, but they could have killed the boy. The consequences would have been less severe compared to the large-scale assault that Atlas and the others carried out at Nevermore." Unc Elliot hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I learned that Crackstone's crypt holds the demonic book he used. A major distraction was needed so that Atlas and the others could operate freely on Nevermore's grounds," Elliot answered, deciding to tell the truth. He knew it was useless to lie to Edward, the most powerful psychic. "The Book of Unc," Edward said slowly, and Elliot nodded. "You disobeyed my order to get the Book of Soiga and keep it for yourself. You are a very loyal follower, Elliot," Edward added sarcastically. "That's not true, Patriarch," Elliot said nervously. "Silence," Edward commanded, and Elliot immediately closed his mouth. He began to feel an icy chill. Frost started to form on the floor near him, reaching his hands and quickly creeping up his arms. The cold was extreme. He had never felt such an intense chill. If it continued, he could freeze to death, whether he resisted with his fire aura or not. "You're nearing 40 and already crave a demonic book to increase your powers. You're impatient. You're not ready yet. Your father made a pact shortly after you were born. He was 90. Be patient," said Edward. "It's true, Patriarch. I'm impatient. I will follow your advice," Elliot replied, avoiding eye contact and speaking in a servile tone. "You don't even have descendants now. If you gain demonic powers, it will be even harder for you to have new children. Your younger brother has 2 talented daughters, though they don't match your late daughter, who had 2 auras. What a shame the family lost a dual aura user because of your greed," said Edward, shaking his head slightly. Elliot remained silent. It was best to say nothing. Excuses would be pointless. "You've made 2 major mistakes since you took the position of patriarch. First, you were unaware of Luke Poe's birth, the source of our troubles, and now this. Perhaps your brother would be better suited as patriarch," Edward said, narrowing his eyes at Elliot. "Give me another chance, Patriarch. This time I will act personally and eliminate Luke Poe. I won't let anything distract me," Elliot said with determination. Edward remained silent until he finally spoke. "Very well, but if you fail again, losing the position of patriarch won't be the only thing at stake." Elliot felt a shiver run down his spine, but he said nothing and merely nodded obediently. "The boy has special protection now. We can't set foot in Nevermore to attack him. Any assassination attempt against him will bring punishment to the family." "Doesn't that matter?" Elliot asked with some uncertainty. He didn't want to bring more punishments upon the family. "If you kill him at Nevermore without involving third parties, the punishment is manageable, as long as you don't launch a destructive scale attack. We can handle the consequences. Do not kill any students or teachers," Edward replied. "As you command," said Elliot. With permission granted, he could act without fear of potential punishment. although he had to focus solely on Luke Poe and avoid involving others. Which could pose problems if the boy had any support. Any news of the maid? Edward asked, referring to the only servant of the Poe family, the one who hid Luke Poe as a baby and cared for him without their knowledge. Natasha, the Carrier clan is hunting her down. She'll soon be our prisoner. She must be exhausted from the pursuit by now, Elliot replied. Oh, that clan of half-bloods accepted the request? Edward asked with mild interest. The Carrier clan is a group of half-bloods exiled from their families to make a living. They accept less than legitimate requests, such as assassinations, theft of dark artifacts, trafficking of dangerous creatures, and other shady dealings. In Edward's time, that clan existed, but they didn't accept the Spellman's request to hunt down the Poes. This was mainly because they didn't want to earn the ire of a powerful psychic family like the Poes. However, the Poes were no longer what they once were. Now only a 15-year-old boy bore the name. And then there was his servant. They no longer fear the name of an almost extinct family. I have to admit, they're experts at tracking people. With their help, we'll be able to capture the servant before she reaches Nevermore, said Elliot. Good. Did they find out why she moved so far away from Luke Poe? Edward asked. It wasn't normal for Natasha to be separated from Luke for so long. She must have a goal, no, but once they bring her here, we'll find out, Elliot said, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Edward snorted lightly at Elliot's uselessness and ordered him to leave, which Elliot gratefully did. The Book of Unk. Edward murmured, his expression thoughtful. Luke was gazing up at the blue sky, sitting on the grass under the shade of a large tree. A short distance away, Wednesday sat with her back straight, reading a small book. Both were silent. Only the soft breeze and the sounds of nature could be heard. They had found a small secluded spot near the building where Wednesday attended her beekeeping club meetings. They had been sitting in silence for over 30 minutes, Wednesday reading without lifting her eyes from her book, and Luke staring at the sky, lost in his own thoughts. After a few more minutes, Wednesday closed her book and looked at Luke, who seemed like a statue. A few days ago, they had made their relationship official, becoming what society would call a couple. Wednesday had never thought the day would come when she would have a boyfriend. Throughout her life, many boys had tried to approach her, both at the normie school she attended and at Nevermore, before her relationship with Luke developed. However, none of those boys had caught her interest, and she quickly pushed them away since they couldn't tolerate her personality. Though some were more persistent than others, she didn't think she was capable of forming a romantic connection with anyone. If she wasn't suited to being a friend, how could she even imagine herself as a girlfriend? She saw herself as someone distant, with clearly defined priorities. Her own interests always came first. The affection of others was nothing more than a bothersome detail she preferred to ignore. However, sitting in front of her was Luke, the only person with whom no problems ever rose. Not because she had changed, but because Luke was so similar to her. They both shared an innate arrogance, a certain narcissism, and a lack of interest in conventional relationships. Like her, Luke had no qualms about putting his own needs first. On top of that, they were both geniuses, far superior to others their age when it came to combat skills. Wednesday wouldn't want to be with a weakling who didn't know how to fight. Luke felt the same. In the long run, he didn't want a burden as a girlfriend. It would be annoying to constantly have to protect her. What are you thinking about? It's rare for you to be silent for so long, Wednesday asked, her usual unflappable expression fixed on Luke. I thought you liked silence, Luke said, still staring at the sky. I do, Wednesday replied, her tone completely flat. I'm just asking about the anomaly of your closed mouth. Instead of beating around the bush, answer. Luke let out a slight smile before responding. I'm thinking about Natasha, the housekeeper, Wednesday asked, raising an eyebrow. Yes, Luke confirmed, his hand resting on his chin as if reflecting more to himself than to her. It's been a while since I've heard from her. I wonder if she's all right. His tone was casual, but there was a hint of unease in his words, something unusual for him. How touching. You're worried about a mere housekeeper, Wednesday commented. It's more than that, Luke replied. She's been with me since forever, even though she didn't provide many benefits as the caretaker of the orphanage. Thanks to her, I'm still alive. Moreover, Natasha's mission was important. She needed to find the place where his parents had hidden the evidence they had gathered all this time. Wednesday moved a little closer to Luke, enough for her shadow to stretch over him. So you're worried about her? She asked. It seemed strange to her that Luke would care about someone. The only person she knew who had affected Luke emotionally was Enid, and that didn't seem to be a big deal since they broke their promise and had an argument. But here was Luke, in the same mood as before and not too affected by it. It's natural to worry about someone who has been a part of your life for years, Luke explained, staring intently at Wednesday. Natural perhaps for you, Wednesday retorted, tilting her head slightly as she studied his reaction. You're not the one to say that, Luke thought with a slight smile, gazing at Wednesday's face, which was just inches from his own. From the series, he knew that Wednesday cared about her family members. When Thing nearly died, she showed deep concern. She also defended her brother, albeit in an unconventional way. Here, although she was colder and more ruthless than in the series, she still showed concern for her loved ones. Like with Thing or her younger brother, she defended Eugene solely because he reminded her of her brother. She even wanted to save Nevermore from the prophecy and Rowan when she saw his future death. She also helped him and showed her concern in her own way. She wasn't a robot without emotions. If she were, she wouldn't have accepted to be his girlfriend. I remember you telling me that you confronted your brother's abusers. That's because he matters to you. Luke said, matters, Wednesday repeated, almost as if the word were foreign to her. If you call worrying about someone burying your brother alive, he added, burying him. What a way to show affection, Luke said, unable to suppress a slight laugh still. You were expelled from your last school for nearly killing the bully who messed with your brother. Why would you defend him if he doesn't matter to you? Luke added, it's the most logical thing. I won't let anyone bother him, except for me, she retorted, unfazed. Luke smiled, recognizing the twisted nuance in her words. He knew that this was how Wednesday processed what others would call concern. Then if someone bothers me, you'd make sure to be the only one doing it, Luke asked with a slight smile. If someone bothers you, I'll make sure they stop, although I doubt anyone would dare, and if you're bothered, I don't think you'll need my help, Wednesday replied. You're right, I'll take care of it. I don't want you to get expelled for murder, Luke said. At that moment, Luke's expression changed. What happened? Wednesday asked, noticing the shift in his expression. It went from carefree to alert. It's Natasha. She seems to be in trouble, Luke said, standing up. Chapter 124 Saving Natasha. Luke was flying over the Jericho forest at high speed. Wednesday was on his back, her arms wrapped around his neck. Her black pigtails fluttered in the force of the wind. Distance, Wednesday asked through their mental link. 50 Acom. We'll arrive in about 30 minutes, Luke replied. How many enemies? Wednesday asked. 3, from a clan called Carrier. Never heard of them, Luke responded. Clan of exiles involved in assassinations and shady dealings. As far as I know, they're all half-breeds who were shunned and expelled from their families, so they banded together in this clan. Wednesday explained. Then they shouldn't be powerful, Luke remarked. Half-breeds had less talent than someone fully outcast. This wasn't like Harry Potter, where half-bloods could be the most powerful. Don't be overconfident. They have a strong reputation for being effective in the missions they take. They're half-breeds who face outcast ones, and yet they can still kill their targets, Wednesday said. She trusts her strength but never underestimates an enemy. As for Luke, he's become more arrogant since defeating Atlas, a Gorgon over 100 years old who wielded mythical bronze. You know a lot about the dark dealings of the outcast world, Luke said with a slight smile. I've always liked dark and underground topics, like demons, dark rituals, assassin, Wednesday replied, beginning to list several dark and shady subjects that piqued her interest. As they flew, the landscape changed. The trees became much taller, surpassing 30 meters in height, with wide trunks ranging between 1.5 and 3 meters in diameter. Their canopies, situated at the top, formed a dense network of foliage, though spaced far enough apart to allow broad stretches of space between them. Luke flew above the trees at a height of about 50 meters. Thanks to his enhanced vision and the gaps between the trees, he noticed a figure running at great speed through the forest, zigzagging between the trunks in a clear attempt to escape. Luke immediately recognized the figure by her distinctive red hair. It was Natasha. She didn't look in good shape. She had several cuts bleeding from different parts of her body, and she was limping. However, her speed was incredible, giving her a slight lead over her 3 pursuers. There they are, Luke said, his expression more furious than before at seeing Natasha's condition because of these 3 men. Wednesday had to focus her eyes to make out the 4 figures in the distance. Though her vision was sharp, it couldn't compare to Luke's. A clairvoyant can enhance their vision to a level comparable to an eagle's, and even surpass that bird. 3 Oris, thought Wednesday, unable to deny feeling a bit envious. Having 3 Oris already put you on a completely different level. A fat guy, a skeleton and a dwarf. What a peculiar group, Luke commented as he began descending rapidly toward their new enemies. The leader of the group was a tall, lanky, pale person who looked like a skeleton. His skin clung to his bones and was ghostly pale. He had curly black hair, black painted lips, and even black painted nails. He looked like a drug-addicted rocker. To his right was a large, overweight man with a big belly. He wore a black t-shirt and dark pants. He also had multiple piercings in his ears. Lastly, the short man had a more normal expression compared to his two companions. Too normal. He had brown bowl-cut hair, a grey jacket and pants. If I had to guess, the skeleton is a vampire, the fat guy a werewolf, and the dwarf, I don't know, said Wednesday as she got a clearer look at the three men. Luke was about to say something when Wednesday, without waiting, interrupted him. The skeleton is mine, she said, and without giving any time for replies, she launched into the attack. Wednesday leaned forward, resting her hands on Luke's shoulders, and in one smooth and fluid motion, propelled herself with great force. The momentum, combined with the speed at which they were flying, catapulted her with impressive acceleration. The skeleton only had time to lift his head and see Wednesday holding her dark scythe, making a downward cut toward him. The strike descended quickly and lethally, aimed directly at the skeleton man's head. In a swift reflex, the man raised his pale, bony hands to protect himself. From those hands, a dark stream of blood erupted, quickly molding into a shield that covered him from the black blade of the scythe. Wednesday's scythe collided with the blood shield, and a sharp sound resonated in the air. The blood shield withstood the impact for only 3 seconds before crumbling, allowing the scythe to continue on its path. However, those 3 seconds of resistance gave the man just enough time to evade the blow, though not entirely. The black blade grazed his skull, leaving a long wound that pierced through his scalp, from which blood began to flow. A vampire, just as I expected, Wednesday thought, watching as the vampire man staggered back, his eyes filled with surprise and fury fixed on her. Are you okay, Shark? Asked the short man, approaching his companion. The vampire named Shark nodded slightly without taking his gaze off Wednesday. The fat man didn't stop to check on his teammate. He ran toward Wednesday, his large right arm transforming into the arm of a werewolf, covered in grey fur and ending in claws. His furry fist gained more strength and size as it headed toward Wednesday, who remained frozen in place with a stoic expression. Just before the werewolf's fist got any closer to Wednesday, Luke arrived, surrounded by numerous condensed telekinetic waves around his fist. Bam! Both fists collided, creating a shockwave that stirred up a large amount of wind and dust. Luke's condensed telekinetic waves were released, unleashing a power that surpassed that of the werewolf, who was pushed back about 10 meters. He didn't go flying. His strength is good, Luke thought, shaking his hand slightly. With his telekinetic punches, he could send Atlas flying, a Gorgon who possessed mythical bronze. Although he never had a fistfight with the Gorgon, it was more likely he would have lost. Luke always dodged his blows and then struck back, sending him flying. Never more uniforms. You must be Luke Poe, and you're Wednesday Adams, said the vampire named Shark, examining Luke and Wednesday. Correct. Should we give you a prize? I didn't bring any candy with me, Luke commented with a slight mocking smile, searching through his empty pockets. Great arrogance. It's normal after he killed the Gorgon and the children of Elliot Spellman. I must use this to my advantage, Shark thought. He was more concerned about the girl with the stoic expression holding a dark scythe. It wouldn't be good for the Carrier clan to make enemies with the Adams family, a powerful family of psychics. We can't kill her, Shark thought, drawing a long knife. Blue Aura, commented the short man. They had been chasing Natasha for days. They knew she was cut off from communication. She didn't have a phone. The only way she could ask for help would be through telepathy. That means before the short man could continue speaking, an invisible force pinned him down. He could no longer move a single muscle, not even his jaw to speak. Wednesday, who had been still, raised her hand and made a slight gesture pointing at the man. From the ground where the man stood, spikes of darkness emerged, piercing him from different angles. They penetrated his body with great precision. He couldn't do anything about the sudden immobilization. That wasn't all. Luke pointed at him with his hand and lifted the dying little man into the air. With a swift motion, he directed him toward the ground with overwhelming force. The ground trembled as the man's body hit with such intensity that his bones broke with a sharp crack. The screams of pain quickly extinguished, and the body lay sprawled in a grotesque position, barely moving. Shark and the werewolf could do nothing to defend their companion. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. Luke and Wednesday didn't even exchange a glance to execute the coordinated attack. I wonder what kind of outcast he was, Luke remarked, resting a hand on his chin. It doesn't matter, he was weak, Wednesday replied, her gaze filled with disdain for the short man's body. There was not a trace of regret or confusion in her expression for having killed a man in a matter of seconds. Shark and the werewolf frowned slightly. They were not angry about their companion's death. They felt no such camaraderie. Moreover, the short man was the weakest of the three, so his death wasn't a significant blow to their battle power. Luke and Wednesday didn't say another word. Each of them launched at great speed toward their enemy, Wednesday against Shark and Luke against the fat man. Let's see how strong you are, Carrier Clan, Luke thought, propelling himself with a telekinetic wave toward the werewolf. Chapter 125, Team Carrier exterminated. Luke condensed telekinetic waves into the sole of his foot and struck at the werewolf, who could only cross his arms in an X to defend himself. He was pushed back more than 10 meters, crashing into one of the large trees. The trunk was strong enough not to shatter from the impact. Luke advanced toward his enemy, leaving Wednesday to deal with the vampire. He had wanted to fight a vampire, but she had chosen first. I wonder how strong a half-blooded werewolf is. Too bad you didn't inherit both of your parents' outcast genes, Luke commented with a slightly disappointed expression. The fight would have been more exciting if his enemy had two types of powers. Luke's mental reading had improved significantly compared to before. Now, with just eye contact, he could read memories from hours earlier, not just current thoughts. This allowed him to learn the werewolf's name and a few other irrelevant details. The werewolf named Jacob looked surprised by Luke's comment. "Get out of my mind, telepath," Jacob shouted, hitting his head hard. An unorthodox but effective method, Luke thought with a slight grimace as he was forced out of Jacob's thoughts. He hadn't been able to delve too deeply into his memories. After that, Jacob's body began to change. In less than 5 seconds, his arms grew hairier and more muscular. Claws sprouted from his thick hands. Partial transformation, huh? Luke thought as he watched Jacob sprint toward him at full speed. Luke manipulated the telekinetic waves around him. When Jacob was about 5 meters away, he unleashed them in an explosion of kinetic waves that expanded in all directions. The blast reached a radius of 10 meters, hitting Jacob with the shockwave. His body was suspended in the air, thrown back as if he were ragdoll. The violent push sent him flying several meters in a matter of seconds. About 10 meters away, Jacob's body slammed into one of the large trees again, but this time the impact was more violent, and the bark cracked. The damage Jacob suffered from this attack was also more severe. He coughed up a large amount of blood and felt several of his ribs break. "Do a full transformation or you won't last long," Luke remarked. From this brief encounter, Luke could tell that the half-blood werewolf in front of him was slightly stronger than Tyler the Hyde. Another half-blood, if he used a full transformation, he would be several levels more powerful than Tyler. "Don't be cocky, kid," Jacob growled, wiping the blood from his mouth. His broken ribs healed, and the cuts he had suffered from the tree's splinters also healed at a rapid pace. Luke wasn't surprised by this. He knew that werewolves had a high regeneration ability. Jacob's body began to change again. His entire body became covered in fur, his muscles grew larger, his human face transformed into that of a wolf, with fangs and grey eyes. His height increased, and the aura he gave off was fiercer than before. His physical strength must surpass Atlas's, and his regeneration is better, Luke thought as he observed the transformation. Atlas was a tank. His mythical bronze skin was very difficult to damage. Though he didn't have the super regeneration of a werewolf or an aura green psychic, his strength of 5 tons was impressive, but not the best. Werewolves his age far exceeded that strength. Atlas's crucial advantage was his skin, tougher than steel, his claws far deadlier than a werewolf's thanks to the mythical bronze, and his petrifying gaze. Even so, Luke considered Atlas a more challenging opponent than the werewolf before him. Skin tougher than steel was no joke, and his mythical bronze claws only needed to graze Luke to cut him cleanly and inflict a serious wound. The werewolf had advanced regeneration. But that's not the same as mythical bronze. If Luke hit him once and didn't give him time to recover, it would be game over for Jacob. He'd be turned to mush before he had a chance to regenerate. Jacob in his full werewolf form began running on all fours toward Luke. His speed reminded Luke of when Atlas had turned his lower body into that of a snake. When Jacob was about 5 meters away, he leapt, quickly closing the distance. Luke created a barrier around his body to defend against the attack. Jacob's claws struck the shield with a dull thud. The telekinetic shield held firm. Before Luke could send Jacob flying, the werewolf kept clawing at the barrier, trying to tear it apart. Is he war-waked? Luke thought. If he tried to release the telekinetic force from the shield to push Jacob away, it would be counterproductive, as the repulsive force wasn't strong enough, and he'd just be left without a barrier to protect himself. The shield couldn't withstand Jacob's barrage of strikes. It shattered, and the sharp claws headed straight for Luke, who was already prepared to dodge the attack. With his observation hockey and the help of telekinetic waves, he moved, evading the attack perfectly. How to Jacob thought, surprised to see how Luke had dodged his attack with such precision. Luke's barrier had lasted less than 5 seconds, and his attack had been fast. How could a telekinetic dodge with such precision? His senses shouldn't be able to keep up with such speed. Wasting no time, Luke concentrated telekinetic waves around his left elbow, enveloping it. The air around him seemed to compress just before impact. As if the very environment tensed, Luke's elbow struck violently against the left side of Jacob's abdomen, just below his ribs, in a vulnerable area. At the moment of impact, a dull crack could be heard. Muscles and internal tissue suffered under the pressure, and air was forcefully expelled from Jacob's lungs, leaving him breathless. His ribs creaked, not breaking but suffering microfractures that sent waves of pain through his torso. The telekinetic energy made the impact not only felt on the surface but also penetrate internally, damaging his organs. Despite the powerful blow, Jacob didn't go flying. Luke controlled his telekinetic force to prevent that from happening. Jacob staggered, his body rigid from the pain. Unable to breathe properly, Luke pressed on with his attack, giving him no time to recover. His left fist struck Jacob's left lung, causing more pain and making it even harder for him to catch his breath. Before Jacob could even process the pain, Luke's right fist slammed directly into his jaw with such force that his teeth ground together and his head snapped to the side, leaving his vision momentarily blurred. Then, Luke struck Jacob's abdomen again with a punch right in the same spot where his elbow had landed earlier, increasing the internal damage and tearing muscles. Each blow was faster than the last. Luke enveloped his fists with telekinetic waves, but without condensing too much, ensuring the werewolf wouldn't be sent flying. The speed and force of the compressed telekinetic attacks made each punch feel like an internal explosion. Jacob's healing factor didn't have enough time to recover from so many internal injuries at such a rapid pace. Finally, when Luke sensed Jacob was on the verge of collapse, he spun his body, lifting his right leg and delivering a kick to the center of the werewolf's furry abdomen. This time, an immense amount of telekinetic energy concentrated in his leg, exponentially increasing the power of the impact. Bam! Jacob was sent hurtling backward at great speed, his body flying like a projectile. As Jacob flew toward the splintered trunk, the same one that had survived the previous impact, Luke aimed both hands at him, and telekinetic waves began to twist in the air around him. Just before the werewolf reached the tree trunk, Luke gave a violent telekinetic pull. Jacob's speed doubled in an instant, his body accelerating toward the tree faster than before. Jacob crashed into the trunk with an explosion of splinters and wood. The already splintered trunk finally gave way, breaking with a deafening crack. Shards of wood flew everywhere, and the tree slowly collapsed while Jacob's body fell to the ground, completely shattered, unable to move after the brutal beating he had endured. Fortunately for Luke, the enormous tree didn't fall in his direction, so he didn't need to dodge it, as he wouldn't have been able to move it with his telekinesis. That tree must weigh more than 5 tons. He is not comparable to Atlas, thought Luke as he walked toward Jacob's battered body, which was beginning to revert to its human form. He observed Jacob's severely wounded body, breathing heavily and looking at Luke with half-closed eyes, a clear expression of surprise in his gaze. "So, you possess 3 auras," Jacob commented with difficulty, coughing up blood. His head rested against the base of the fallen tree. There was a rumor about Luke that had been circulating throughout the outcast society. The rumor was that he possessed 3 auras. The rumor had 2 solid foundations. First, that he had defeated Atlas, a Gorgon who could petrify with just eye contact. How did he defeat that veteran Gorgon? He would have had to cover his eyes, no doubt. If he didn't have a clairvoyant aura, he would be an idiot, since he'd be an easy target. Secondly, the memory extracts Luke presented to the outcast police. Some people believed he had obtained these memory extracts with the help of a telepath, while others said he possessed a blue aura like his mother. But if that were true, it would mean one of these 2 theories was false. So many believed that both were real, which made Luke a user of 3 auras: telekinesis, clairvoyance, and telepathy. "Yes," Luke replied, with a barely perceptible smile, showing neither alarm nor concern. Pretty cool, right? He knew the news would spread sooner or later, and there was no point in hiding it anymore. The only downside was that he wouldn't be able to surprise the Spellmans like before. His attention quickly returned to Jacob, whose wounds, despite the brutal beating, were beginning to heal. Jacob was recovering but needed several minutes to fully heal, and Luke had no intention of giving him that chance. Luke took a step forward and slowly raised his leg. "What are you doing?" Jacob asked with difficulty, trying to buy some time to move and attempt to survive. The same thing you would do, Luke responded. Without using telekinesis or any extra power, he simply pulled his leg back and kicked Jacob's head hard. The sound of the impact was sharp and solid. Jacob's skull cracked, but it wasn't enough. Luke, unmoved, repeated the process. He lifted his leg and struck again, over and over. Each blow echoed louder than the last, and Jacob's head, unable to heal fast enough, began to give way. Why did it all end like this? Jacob thought. The mission was supposed to be easy by now. The Poe family's housekeeper was already badly injured and exhausted after being hunted for days by several different groups. Flesh tore, bones cracked. With each hit, Jacob's head broke apart like an overripe fruit. Finally, after several strikes, the werewolf's head was completely shattered, scattering blood and fragments of bone across the ground like a smashed watermelon. And so, Jacob died. His healing factor wasn't advanced enough to save him if his brain was crushed and destroyed. "I stained my shoe," Luke thought with a slight grimace as he looked at his white sneaker, now covered in blood. Luke turned and began walking toward Wednesday. The distance between them had increased due to their respective battles. As he moved, his eyes caught the signs of a fierce struggle. The ground was marked by deep, long slashes and small craters. He saw Wednesday sitting on the ground, her back resting against the trunk of a tree. She seemed to be catching her breath, her face as impassive as ever. Not far from her, a dark, dense, twisted spear, as if made of pure shadows, was impaled vertically into the ground, completely piercing through a pale head. The dark spear had punctured the skull belonging to Shark the vampire. The vampire's black curly hair fell messily around his face, contrasting with the paleness of his skin. Shark's decapitated body lay nearby, sprawled on the ground. The three-man team sent by the Carrier clan had been killed by Luke and Wednesday. Chapter 126. Unusual comfort. Luke noticed that Wednesday had a cut on her shoulder and blood was coming out of it. The cut wasn't deep, but it was strange to see that someone could hurt her. "Are you okay?" Luke asked, hurrying to her side and kneeling down, looking at her wound with some concern. "It's just a small cut. It's nothing," Wednesday said dryly, trying to push Luke's hand away. But in the end she didn't. She liked that Luke showed concern for her, which didn't happen often, but she wouldn't show it openly. "It's not deep, but it's long. You'll need a new uniform," Luke commented, looking closely at the wound. Wednesday's black jacket had torn, along with the shirt underneath, exposing the skin of her delicate shoulder. It was the first time Luke had seen Wednesday's pale shoulder. "What am I thinking?" Luke thought, shaking his head. "It's just a little blood. I'll be fine," Wednesday said, pushing Luke aside and standing up. Already recovered, they had both killed outcast adults who specialized in hunting missions, and only Wednesday ended up with a minor cut. Few students were capable of such a feat. "If you say so," Luke said, shrugging. He knew how independent Wednesday was. It would be pointless to show more concern. Quickly, both of them headed toward Natasha, who was lying on a large stone with her eyes half closed. Her condition wasn't good. "Natasha, are you okay?" Luke asked, hurrying to her side. Her breathing was weak, and she had several cuts. One on her cheek, another on her stomach that was deep and bleeding, and several more on her legs. Natasha's red hair was dirty and disheveled, as if she had been on the run for days. For the first time, Wednesday saw Luke's housekeeper, a beautiful red-haired woman who must have been around 30 or a bit older. "Luke, you came," Natasha said slowly, opening her eyes tiredly and looking toward Luke. She was happy to see him after so long. "What about the pursuers?" Natasha asked with difficulty. Her vision was blurry. She had been pursued for days. "They are all dead." "We need to get back to Nevermore quickly," Luke said, turning around so Natasha could climb onto his back. With effort she climbed onto Luke's back, intertwining her hands around his neck. Luke stood up and looked at the sky. They had to reach Nevermore as soon as possible so Natasha could be treated by the nurse or Professor Fitz. "I heard everything you did. Your mother would be proud of you." "I'm proud of you, Luke. Maybe I wasn't the best nanny during your childhood, but I've always been proud of you," Natasha said slowly, with her eyes closed, resting her head on the back of Luke's neck. Luke's expression changed upon hearing those words. He felt a warm sensation in his chest. It was rare for him to feel this in either of his two lives. "Thanks, but don't talk anymore, or you'll lose strength," Luke said with an odd expression. He wasn't used to such direct displays of affection from Natasha. "I just had to tell you." Before she could continue, Luke interrupted her. "Hey, don't raise a death flag. You're not going to die, just rest. We'll be at Nevermore in 20 minutes or less," Luke said. Natasha smiled faintly and rested her head on Luke's neck. "Am I supposed to wait here?" Wednesday asked, raising an eyebrow, looking at Natasha on Luke's back. That was her spot. Yes, I'll come back for you later. You can walk to Nevermore while you wait for me, Luke said. He was about to take off but stopped. He noticed the dissatisfaction on Wednesday's face. Although her expression remained almost the same, after spending so much time with her, Luke could tell she wasn't happy. Would you prefer if I carried you like a princess? Luke asked with a barely perceptible smile. It wasn't the best moment to tease her. It's better than getting my shoes dirty walking through this forest, Wednesday said in her usual flat tone, taking a step toward Luke to be carried. I didn't expect her to agree, Luke thought, as he efficiently lifted her. He held her in the typical princess carry. Though the scene was far from sweet or romantic, Wednesday's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, devoid of any trace of discomfort. Her hands, instead of holding onto Luke, rested on her own lap. Luke took off without saying another word, gradually picking up speed. Besides flying, he used his telekinesis to ensure Natasha wouldn't fall, as she had fallen asleep. Wednesday remained unfazed. Luke's hands were constantly touching her, unlike when she was on his back, but she didn't mind. To Luke's surprise, he managed to reach Nevermore in 18 minutes. He hadn't realized that situations where people you care about are in danger could give you a power-up. A few minutes before arriving at Nevermore, Luke sent a telepathic message to Larissa. When they arrived, the nurse and Professor Fitz were already waiting and immediately began treating Natasha without wasting any time. Will she be okay? Luke asked, looking at the elderly nurse. Yes, she just needs to rest for a few hours. She hasn't slept for days. She has multiple external and internal injuries, even poison, and she hasn't eaten in days, the nurse explained briefly, while ushering everyone out of the room so Natasha could rest peacefully. When she wakes up, I'll let you know immediately, the nurse said, noticing Luke's reluctance to leave the room. After that, Luke and Wednesday started walking toward the dorms, both in silence. You seem very worried about her, Wednesday commented, breaking the silence. She knew Luke wasn't emotional, but it was rare to see him so clearly concerned about someone. The Poe family is nearly extinct. It's just her and me against the Spellmans, who make demonic deals. Thanks to Natasha, I didn't die as a baby, and I consider her an older sister. Do you understand why I'm worried about her? Luke said, raising his voice, irritated by Wednesday's constant questioning about his concern for Natasha, as if she were expendable. I understand, it makes sense. She's more than just a housekeeper, Wednesday nodded. Unfazed by Luke's tone, Wednesday added, stopping in her tracks, causing Luke to stop as well and look at her with a slightly furrowed brow. It's not just you and her, I'm here too. I'll help you cut off the Spellmans' heads. Don't leave me out, Wednesday said. Extending her hand and taking Luke's, his furrowed brow softened, replaced by a surprised look, similar to when Natasha told him she was proud of him. What was happening today? The two coldest and most reserved women he knew had both comforted him. It was a strange yet comforting feeling. Thanks. Sorry for raising my voice, Luke said, scratching his cheek with one hand while holding Wednesday's cold pale hand with the other. It was my fault for asking the same question multiple times, Wednesday replied, not giving it much importance. Did she just say it was her fault? Luke thought, still surprised by Wednesday's attitude. Let's go to the cafeteria. I'm hungry after killing those people from the Carrier clan, Wednesday said, letting go of Luke's hand and changing their destination. Luke followed her. He was hungry too after the battle and flying at high speed for nearly an hour. Chapter 127, Natasha's Information. Luke was in the infirmary, watching as Natasha devoured one plate of food after another. She had already recovered. She was wearing a patient's uniform and eating as if possessed by the demon of gluttony. Her wounds had healed, and she only had bandages on her left arm and hand. It looks like you're doing well if you can eat that fast, Luke remarked, feeling more at ease seeing the housekeeper in such good condition. Try barely eating anything for 2 weeks while being hunted and attacked by assassins who never rest, Natasha replied, pausing her meal for a moment. She took a napkin, delicately wiped her mouth, then drank some water before continuing to eat. That's her personality, Luke thought with a slight smile, letting Natasha eat in peace. 10 minutes later she finished and looked at Luke. You've accomplished a lot since I left, Natasha commented, praising him. No Poe ever struck such a hard blow to the Spellman reputation and killed 2 direct heirs, not to mention killing a powerful servant like Atlas. I know, Luke said, as modest as ever. Natasha added with a slight sarcastic smile, do you want me to tell you everything the Spellmans went through? Luke asked, and Natasha nodded. During her return to Jericho while being chased, she hadn't learned everything in detail. She wanted specifics. Luke focused more on the battle he had against Atlas, Sabrina and Sebastian during the Blood Moon, and on the fleeting memories he managed to read from Atlas before he died. It's clear they want to kill you with much more enthusiasm than they did your father. I don't think the protection the Congress gave you will be of much help, Natasha commented after Luke finished his story. Luke nodded. He thought the same. If they attacked Nevermore with an army of thousands of undead, he doubted that just because the council forbade them from attacking him at Nevermore, they would comply. Most likely, they would still decide to attack him, just on a smaller scale, avoiding trying to kill others, although there could be injuries and school property might be destroyed. And what about you? Did you find what my parents hid? Since when has the Carrier clan been hunting you? Luke asked, firing several questions at once. My destination was Ohio. I got there without being pursued by anyone. But during my stay, they discovered me. The Spellmans twice requested the services of the Carrier clan, once at the beginning of the war when Lord Edgar's brother was alive. And now, the first time they rejected the request because the Poes were still an important family of psychics. This time, they accepted, believing there's no harm in doing so when you're the only one left alive, Natasha said. They could have requested their services during my father's time. Luke said, his father, like him, had been the only surviving member of the Poe family. They didn't need to. Why request the help of the Carrier clan when they can take care of the last Poe themselves? Now they've requested their services again because something is different. They want to kill you with such intensity for some reason we don't know, Natasha said. Maybe because of my 3 Horus. There's a prophecy that says I'll kill them all, Luke replied with a slight narcissistic smile. It's possible. It'll only put you in more danger. But we have to deal with that, Natasha said. The Carrier work in teams of 3, a fighter, a tank, and a support. I took down 2 groups, and the third was handled by you and your goth girlfriend, Natasha added. Luke let the comment about his goth girlfriend slide and was surprised by the fact that Natasha had taken out 2 groups, a total of 6 outcasts. You managed to kill that many? Luke asked, his tone surprised. Natasha is a shapeshifter, like Mystique from the X-Men. Her power isn't much in battles between outcasts, where vampires, werewolves, psychics and others fight. On the other hand, Amaranth, the vampire shapeshifter, if she drank the blood of a victim, like a werewolf, could replicate some of their power. But that's only because she's a hybrid, part shapeshifter and part vampire. This is why it was hard for Luke to believe that Natasha had managed to eliminate 6 outcasts. How do you kill a group of 3 when you're alone and can only change your appearance? Seems like you have little confidence in my strength despite all the times I beat you in combat, Natasha said. In those fights, I was a beginner and couldn't use my Horus. Luke replied, that's true. Watch, Natasha said as she extended her right arm with a mysterious smile. Luke watched curiously, his eyes fixed on Natasha's delicate fingers as they began to transform before him. The smooth skin of her hand started to darken and harden. Her palm and fingers lengthened, sharpening with precision, until they formed a thin, lethal blade, gleaming under the room's light. The blade extended from the tips of her fingers down to just below her elbow, creating a perfect, deadly extension of her arm. Incredible, Luke said, wide-eyed. He hadn't expected this. How do you do it? Shapeshifters are only supposed to change into people, not objects, Luke added, examining the sharp blade in front of him. The metal was incredibly hard, probably steel, witchcraft. Natasha answered, aren't you afraid of becoming a deranged hag? Luke asked, recalling the hag he had faced over a year ago, a deformed, ugly creature, completely mad. I'm willing to take the risk if it means protecting you and eliminating the Spellmans, Natasha replied. I can protect myself. You don't need to risk yourself for me, Luke said, feeling a bit embarrassed by her comment. Oh, how brave. Should I give you a pat on the back? Natasha asked with a slight mocking smile. Stop making fun of me. I'm serious. If we had both gone, we could have defeated the Carrier clan without much trouble, Luke said in a serious tone. Natasha had arrived badly injured, which made sense after facing 3 groups of outcasts who specialized in hunts and assassinations. Natasha's mocking smile faded as she looked at Luke in surprise. It was the second time she'd seen Luke worry about her. The first was just a few hours ago, when she was half dead. She knew she hadn't treated Luke well in the orphanage, which is why their relationship wasn't great. After officially meeting in Larissa's office over a year ago, Luke started attending Nevermore, and they became separated again. Then, during Luke's first summer vacation from Nevermore, she sent him to his maternal family's home and left him there. She knew Luke didn't get along with them, and they didn't like him either. But she believed it was the best option. Because of all this, she thought Luke held some antipathy toward her. She believed he would never worry about her or consider her part of his family. Knowing Luke's strange little sociopathic, though she wasn't the best judge of that, an antisocial personality. She didn't think he would ever care about her, given how their relationship had developed. Natasha, Luke said, noticing that the redhead wasn't responding. He saw a strange gleam in her eyes, something unusual. You're right. It's better for us to act together now that we know the Spellmans will come after you by any means necessary. Natasha said, snapping back to reality, feeling a relief she'd never experienced before. She did not dislike Luke's concern for her. Good. On another hand, can you transform your body into metal, like metal skin? Luke asked, curious. If she could do that, she'd be like Colossus from the X-Men. That would give her 2 X-Men powers. Yes, Natasha replied, and her face turned a metallic color. Incredible, Luke murmured, wondering what dark rituals Natasha had to perform to alter her body like this. One of Goody Adams' rituals in her Book of Shadows involved gathering various mutilated body parts for a dark resurrection ritual. Let's get back to what's important, Natasha said, returning her skin to normal. Oh right, did you find the evidence my parents and the other Poe ancestors gathered? Luke asked. I found a location, but not where they're hidden exactly. Your parents were very careful. They likely put protections in place, so recovering them won't be easy, Natasha replied, starting to share what she knew. The evidence was in Ohio, as she'd mentioned before, specifically in 2 cities, Shadesize and Sunnyvale. They would need to search there. Natasha had to halt her search due to her pursuers. She didn't want to draw attention and raise suspicions that there might be something hidden in those 2 seemingly ordinary small towns. We can go now, Luke suggested, eager to find the evidence. That's not the smartest move. You killed Elliot Spellman's 2 children. It's possible he'll take action himself, especially if you leave Nevermore. We need to prepare, Natasha said. We'll go to Ohio, but not right now, she quickly added when she noticed Luke was about to protest. Finish the school year. There's less than a month left. In the meantime, we need to plan how to go to Ohio to search for the evidence. Luke nodded, understanding Natasha's point. It would be dangerous to go to Ohio, just the 2 of them. The entire Spellman family could attack them. Not just Elliot, but here at Nevermore, any attack would have to be on a smaller scale, as long as Luke stayed at the school. The problem was figuring out how to prepare for the search in Shadesize and Sunnyvale without drawing attention. It would be 2 of them against a whole prominent psychic family. How many Spellmans were there? Luke doubted his ability to face Elliot, unsure of his strength, and if more family members joined in, they'd be in serious trouble. It's not just Natasha and me, there's also Wednesday, Luke thought, recalling his girlfriend's words. Though adding a 3rd person didn't change the situation much. For now, Luke had to stay at Nevermore. He wasn't about to embark on a suicide mission to Ohio with his girlfriend and housekeeper. Chapter 128, Last Days in Nevermore, Monday, May 12, 2022. There were only 2 weeks left before classes ended. This week, all the students were studying like crazy because next week was final exam week. After that, the Raven, Nevermore's annual dance, would take place. Once the Raven ended, the students would head home the next day. It had been an unusual year for the institution. The Poe Cup wasn't held, nor was Parents' Weekend. This was due to the large-scale attack the school had suffered. Everyone knew, thanks to the evidence Luke presented, that the culprits were the Spellmans. To Luke's surprise, no one blamed him, nor did he receive any hostile looks. He thought they would see him as someone dangerous, since it was because of him that the school was attacked and many lives were put at risk. But that didn't happen. The outcasts were very different from the normies. Still studying? Luke asked, closing his laptop after finishing 2 episodes of a series. Each episode lasted more than an hour, and when he started watching, Xavier and Ajax were in the same position as now, sitting on the floor with books on their laps in silence. Yeah, we have to study over 200 years of outcast and normie history. Not all of us have photographic memory, Xavier said, lifting his head from his book and looking at Luke enviously. Having that ability would be so useful. What if you help us with the exam through the telepathic link we have? Ajax asked hopefully. He was already bored out of his mind memorizing dates and events that wouldn't be useful to him at all. It won't work. They have a device that detects brainwaves. They'll know the instant I send a message, Luke said, shaking his head. How do you know that? Xavier asked, raising an eyebrow. Wednesday told me. I wanted her to solve all the tedious problems for me during the math test. Luke replied with a grimace. He wasn't good at math, and having a photographic memory didn't help much if you didn't understand how to do the calculations. We're doomed, Ajax muttered, sighing as he looked at the hundreds of pages he still had to memorize. You have my respect for getting Wednesday to be your girlfriend, Xavier said, giving Luke a thumbs up and looking at him with pride for some reason. I don't know who I respect more. Luke for conquer over Wednesday or Wednesday for conquer over Luke, Ajax said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. True, Xavier said, with a contemplative look as he began to debate in his mind who was harder to win over. Well, Wednesday has a more pessimistic and closed-off personality than our friend. So the point goes to him for getting her interested in him, Ajax said, tilting his head to the side with his eyes closed. Yes, but Luke was in love with Enid, and Wednesday made him choose her. Point for her, Xavier said, and Ajax nodded in agreement. These guys. Luke thought, rolling his eyes. Stop talking nonsense and get back to reading. Those pages won't turn themselves, Luke said, leaving the room. He started walking through the common room of his dorm. The place was silent, with only faint murmurs in the background. At various tables, groups of students were studying together. Luke noticed several eyes on him as he headed towards the exit of the dorm. His popularity, so to speak, had reached a new peak because of everything: the attack on the Blood Moon, him killing Atlas and Elliot's children. And most of all, his 3 auras. Less than 10% of students had a double aura. All those students were well known and had great reputations. Luke became the only psychic student with 3 auras. Too much attention, Luke thought, annoyed by the attention he was receiving. It was already enough being the last living Poe and a famous writer. He left the dorm and started walking through the nearly deserted halls of Nevermore. All the students were studying in their dorms or in the central courtyard, which had been remodeled after the battle. What to do? Luke wondered. He had already trained for more than 3 hours today. Edgar said overtraining wasn't good. 2 things came to Luke's mind: go see Natasha, who was now staying at Nevermore until classes ended, or spend time with Wednesday. He chose Wednesday. Hey, he said, sending her a telepathic message. What? Wednesday replied after almost a minute. Can I come to your room? Luke asked. Why? Wednesday asked. Do I need a reason to visit my lovely, easygoing girlfriend? Luke asked. I suppose you're bored, Wednesday said. Unfazed by Luke's compliment, she knew he only did it to tease her. Fine, you can come, but keep quiet. I'm busy, she added. Yes, ma'am, Luke said, starting to march towards Wednesday's dorm. Because of the location of her room, he could get there from the outside without needing to enter the dorm, which was forbidden. Wednesday had one of the few rooms with a balcony. Luke could fly and reach it easily, so he didn't need to sneak into the girls' dorm. He arrived at the balcony and approached the window, which was already open, so he stepped inside. Wednesday was seated in a chair, typing on an old typewriter. Despite Luke's footsteps, she didn't stop typing or even turn her head. The room was divided into 2. One half belonged to Wednesday, and the other to her roommate. Her former roommate had been Enid. But she had changed rooms after everything that happened with Luke. Luke walked over and sat on Wednesday's bed, which had completely black sheets. Even the pillow was black. Did I stop a friendship from developing? Luke wondered, looking over at the bed that used to belong to Enid. In the series, Wednesday and Enid became best friends. However, that didn't happen here. Luke didn't feel guilty since the Wednesday of this world hadn't really connected with Enid or any other student. She had only connected with him, and that was thanks to the prophecy involving both of them. If the prophecy hadn't existed, Luke thought he would have never become Wednesday's boyfriend or even her friend. Before that, they never spoke to each other, even though they shared a group in one of their classes. Luke took the black pillow, placed it against the wall, and rested his head on it. Lost in thought, he stopped thinking about Wednesday and Enid's almost friendship, and began to think about Ohio, his next destination. He and Natasha had decided to head there, specifically to Shadesize and Sunnyvale. However, they still didn't know how they would go without running the risk of being attacked by all the Spellmans as soon as they found out they had left Nevermore. This might be my last year at Nevermore, Luke thought, feeling a bit melancholic. To his surprise, it had been 2 good school years. Several assassination attempts aimed at him, hag attacks, undead enemies, killing several of his mortal enemies, meeting 2 reliable friends, Xavier and Ajax, and meeting Wednesday. The only bad and good thing at the same time was the situation with Enid, because although it didn't seem to affect him on the surface, it did. The good thing is that she's with me, Luke thought as he glanced at Wednesday. He had told Wednesday that he was going to Ohio to search for the evidence his parents had hidden about the Spellmans, and she agreed without a second of hesitation to go with him. Wednesday found it far more appealing to head to Ohio with Luke, where it was very likely they would face assassination attempts and confront powerful psychics. She preferred that over staying at Nevermore, where she'd be bored without him and have a normal year. How do we get to Ohio in one piece? Luke wondered. One option was to leave Jericho incognito, traveling as stealthily as possible, but the idea wasn't very convincing. Natasha, a shapeshifter, had been found and chased even though it took them a while to locate her. Now it was Luke and Wednesday. They weren't shapeshifters. Sooner or later, they would be found by the Spellmans, who now had the help of the Carrier clan, a group specialized in tracking and pursuing people trying to hide and remain unnoticed. The other option was to ask Larissa for help. The headmistress of Nevermore wanted to do everything she could to help Luke, as she had been Sophie's best friend, his late mother. Despite Larissa's wealth and position as headmistress of Nevermore, she didn't have a large family or the necessary resources to help Luke get to Ohio without being detected by the Spellmans. They still had to figure out a better plan to get to Ohio. What if we ask the Adams for help? Luke thought. He was certain that Wednesday's parents would want to help them. Once, Wednesday had told him that her family couldn't care less about getting involved in other families' feuds. And they loved war, as it meant battles, death, and assassinations. Luke dismissed the idea. He didn't know the Adams well enough to ask them for help, and he also wouldn't tell Wednesday to seek help from her own parents, since she hated asking for their help and preferred to do everything on her own. Luke's eyes started to close as he thought about these complicated and boring matters. In just a few minutes he fell asleep, albeit in a very uncomfortable position. He slept for quite a while until he slowly opened his eyes again. There was less light than before, and he noticed someone sitting just a few inches from him out of the corner of his eye. Wednesday was sitting like a statue, staring at him with her deep dark eyes. "How long was I asleep?" Luke asked, yawning and straightening up a bit. He also noticed a scarred hand resting on his chest thing. Who had been napping on him? Over time, Luke had become friends with the hand. It was very easy to get along with thing. "Almost 2 hours," Wednesday replied, still watching Luke in the same position she'd been in since she sat on the bed. "That long? How long has she been watching me sleep?" Luke thought with a strange expression. If she had been free, she could have woken him up, and they could have done something together. Luke got up from the bed slowly, picked up thing, and placed him in a corner. The hand was in a deep sleep and didn't wake up. "Well, it's late. I'll leave before your roommate gets back," Luke said, walking toward the balcony. He had wanted to spend some time with her, but he was ignored, then ended up falling asleep, and she hadn't even bothered to wake him. He didn't blame her. He knew that Wednesday liked doing her things without being interrupted. It was already a lot that she let him stay in her room while she worked on her novel. "Wait," Wednesday said, grabbing Luke by the wrist. "We can do something. I'm free now," she added in her usual flat tone. "What do you suggest?" Luke asked. "Fencing practice." "Let's go. Move it," Wednesday said without hesitation, walking toward the balcony. "This girl," Luke thought, following her. "You just want to use me as a training dummy to get your revenge," Luke said, walking behind her. In fencing class, the final exam would be an actual tournament. Wednesday wanted revenge on Bianca, so she had been training like crazy to perfect her technique. For that, she needed a training partner who was as much of a challenge as Luke. Luke didn't mind spending time with Wednesday practicing fencing. What bothered him was that he couldn't beat her. He could only win if he used his clairvoyance, and that felt like cheating. "Is your pride hurt because you can't defeat me?" Wednesday asked in a mocking tone, turning around and leaning against the stone balustrade of the balcony. "No, but," Luke replied, unsure of what to say as he stopped near Wednesday. "You're improving a lot too. I was trained by my father from a young age in duels to the death. Your talent is good," Wednesday said, placing both her hands on Luke's cheeks and looking at him intently. "Is she encouraging me?" Luke thought, a bit surprised. It wasn't as rare anymore for Wednesday to comfort him or show more frequent physical affection. They stared at each other for a moment, their faces drawing closer until they kissed for several seconds. Wednesday kept her hands on Luke's cheeks, and he had to lean down slightly due to the height difference. After that, they headed to the gym to practice fencing. Days passed like that. The exam week arrived and ended quicker than most had expected. Wednesday helped Luke with math, and he managed to pass with good grades. He didn't know how his girlfriend was so good at everything, but better for him. Wednesday achieved her revenge against Bianca. She defeated her in the final showdown. Once again, she challenged her to a military duel, no helmets, no points. Only this time, she defeated her decisively and made her bleed. She almost stabbed both of Bianca's eyes, but Professor Vlad managed to stop her in time. This made her classmates fear her even more, further isolating her. She cared little about the opinions of others. Besides, she would be leaving for Ohio the following year. On Friday afternoon, classes officially ended. The students breathed a sigh of relief. There was only one last weekend to spend at Nevermore before heading home. On Sunday, the Raven would take place, which this year had a difference compared to previous years. The novelty of this year's Raven is that all parents are invited to the dance. Since the Parents' Weekend couldn't be held, the school decided to invite parents and families to the Raven, creating a joint theme with the students. For this reason, this year's Raven is mandatory. Wednesday did not like this news at all for two reasons. First, she had to attend a stupid school dance. And second, she had to attend that stupid dance with her family. Luke was indifferent to the news. He had attended the Raven the previous year and had a good time with his two friends. He didn't mind repeating the event. Plus, he would finally get to meet the Addams family. He couldn't deny that he was excited to meet this peculiar family. Chapter 129, Raven 1, Sunday, May 25, 2022, 7 p.m. The secondary gym had been remodeled to serve as the venue for the Raven. Since the students' parents would also be attending, a larger space was needed than the hall typically used. The place had its walls covered with heavy dark grey velvet curtains and was dimly lit. Above, white floating fabrics hung resembling mist intertwined with silver skulls and dry branches. In the center of the ceiling, a large disco ball illuminated the dance floor. Surrounding the area were round tables with white tablecloths and chairs for everyone to sit comfortably and enjoy drinks or food. In the corners stood ice statues of various types of monsters like Hydes, Yetis, and Hags. At the center there was a table with sound equipment controlled by a DJ. The floor exuded a light mist that reached the feet of the guests entering through the two large doors. Students entered accompanied by their parents, all dressed elegantly in white and grey colors. Xavier entered the hall dressed entirely in white tuxedo and shoes. He was accompanied by his father, Vincent Thorpe, a famous psychic in the Outcast Society. Vincent looked very much like Xavier, only a bit taller. He also wore a white tuxedo but with some black details. His face exuded calm, and he had a slight smile as he walked beside his son. "Look, Dad, there's Ajax with his family," said Xavier, pointing to one of the tables that was almost fully occupied. At the table Ajax was sitting, sipping a red drink that looked like blood but wasn't. He was with his father, his younger brother, who also attended Nevermore, and his older brother, who worked in Congress. Vincent nodded and walked with Xavier toward the Gorban family's table. "Steinan, my friend, it's been a long time," said Vincent with a big smile. Extending his hand, Steinan, Ajax's father, was already standing and smiled when he saw Vincent. "My old friend, you finally have time for social gatherings. It's good to see you here," said Steinan, extending his hand for a handshake with Vincent. Steinan appeared to be no older than 30. He stood over 2 meters tall, and unlike Ajax, his hair was uncovered. His snakes were peacefully asleep, not turning anyone to stone. "Work is complicated," said Vincent with a slight smile. Steinan gestured for father and son to sit at his table. Xavier started chatting with Ajax. Ajax's younger brother played on his phone, oblivious to his surroundings, while his older brother began talking with Steinan and Vincent. "I don't see any of your wives. Couldn't they attend?" Vincent asked, noticing only the men of the Petropolis family, Ajax's surname. "It sunk," said Steinan with a sigh. "It's hard to maintain harmony with 3 wives. Every day it gets worse, and they have less patience with each other," he added, shaking his head. As the Thorpe and Petropolis families chatted, more families entered the hall. And the start of the dance was drawing closer. The mermaid family of Kent and Divina were chatting at a table, with Bianca sitting with them since her mother wouldn't be attending the dance. She wasn't in a good mood after losing the final fencing exam to Wednesday in front of everyone. At another table sat Yoka's vampire family. They all wore dark sunglasses and had pale skin. They weren't too fond of the all-white dress code, but they had no choice since that was the theme. Yoko and Divina exchanged glances every now and then but didn't dare approach each other, as they still hadn't told their families about their relationship. Knowing their families were orthodox, like 99% of the outcasts, few outcast families accepted the new trends and fashions of the new generation, who were connected to the normie world through social media and phones. One of those few families was the Ottingers, the family Eugene belonged to. His mother Janet had married Sue, and both were his mothers. Although not all of the Ottingers accepted this, the background music was fitting for an end-of-year dance, though since the dance had not yet started, it was playing softly so people could talk comfortably. 10 minutes before the official start of the dance, the 2 large doors of the gym opened again. A cold breeze swept through the room, causing many families and students to turn their heads. A peculiar and very different family entered the hall. Leading them was a man with a thin mustache and a charming yet sinister smile. It was Gomez Addams, dressed in a dark pinstripe suit and tie. He wasn't much of a fan of white and never adhered to the rules. His stride was firm and passionate as he quickly glanced around. Inspecting the hall, upon noticing the disco ball above the dance floor, his face lit up. "Morticia, my love, would you care for a waltz, like in our student days?" he said in a romantic and melodramatic tone, taking his wife's hand. Morticia Adams followed him with grace. She was also dressed in a sleek long black dress. Her dark hair fell in a perfect cascade over her shoulders, contrasting with her pale skin. "It's not time to dance yet, dear. This place, it could be darker, but it has its charm," Morticia replied in a calm tone as she surveyed the room. Behind them walked a boy of about 10 years old, Pugsley Adams. His hair was short and black, with brown eyes and light freckles. He wore his usual outfit, a striped t-shirt and long shorts. Pugsley's expression reflected a mix of curiosity and slight excitement. While his parents were immersed in their romance, he couldn't help but notice the massive ice statues in the corners. "Do you think a grenade would break them in one hit?" he asked quietly, with a half-smile as he looked at his sister. Walking beside him was Wednesday, dressed in a long, elegant black gown with ruffles that resembled a raven. The ruffles fell in perfect layers, barely brushing the floor, while the fabric shimmered faintly in the gym's dim light. Her lips, painted black, formed a thin line of permanent disapproval. "It's solid ice, probably reinforced by the school staff to withstand heat and pressure. A standard M67 hand grenade wouldn't generate enough energy to completely break it. The explosion produces a blast radius of 2.5 meters, but the fragmentary force wouldn't exceed the 60 psi needed to fracture ice of that mass," she explained without emotion. "You'd likely only create surface cracks. If you really want to destroy it, you'd need something more efficient. Maybe a thermite charge to melt it from the inside, or use liquid nitrogen to weaken its molecular structure before applying any explosives," Wednesday replied in her usual monotone. "I should have brought the thermite charge from Unc," Pugsley murmured as he nodded slowly. Everyone turned to look at the Adams family, who had become the center of attention as they moved toward one of the dimly lit tables. They were the only ones dressed in black, disregarding the raven theme. Many murmured, watching the Adams family as they passed by. Gomez and Morticia paid no attention to the whispers. They were lost in their own world, reminiscing about their fond memories of Nevermore. Pugsley muttered things to himself, and Wednesday stared straight ahead without blinking. "So many memories Nevermore brings back, Karamaya," said Gomez, sitting down in a chair and surveying the hall with a broad smile that showed all his teeth. Morticia, with her usual elegance and poise, sat beside him, crossing her legs with the grace of a dancer. Her dark eyes gleamed with nostalgia as she scanned the room. "Our mon cher, how many nights like this we spent at Nevermore, the waltz under the full moon, the shadows that danced with us, and that time we let the novice werewolves loose during their first transformation," said Morticia with a slight smile. "Poor creatures, they could barely control their instincts. Of course they were supposed to be locked in Lupin's cages, as they always do with the new ones, until they return to their human form." Gomez chuckled softly, recalling the scene. "Ah yes, the teachers were so worried about them, knowing how dangerous they could be during their first full moon, out of control and feral. But we, on the other hand, enjoyed watching them run across the school grounds freed from those cages. It was delicious chaos," Gomez added, giving Morticia's pale hand a gentle kiss. Wednesday had already developed the skill of tuning out her parents' stories. Her gaze shifted downward, and she looked at her new dress. She had bought it at a shop in Jericho just yesterday. The students had one last chance to visit Jericho. She went alone, as Luke didn't go due to a possible attack against him, or at least that was his excuse not to go, since he rarely cared about the Spellman's assassination attempts on him. Like her parents and brother, Wednesday could have worn her usual attire, but she decided to come in this elegant black dress. She wasn't sure why she did it. Well, she actually knew, but she preferred not to think about it. "What are you thinking about, my little viper?" Gomez asked. Wednesday slowly lifted her gaze, her expression remaining unchanged, but her eyes revealed a slight hint of discomfort. Her mind had wandered to thoughts she'd rather not share. "I was thinking about how banal all of this is," she replied in her usual cold tone. "The music, the white dresses, the atmosphere of full celebration. It's suffocating." Gomez smiled. "Always so profound, my little viper. Events like this were never your thing." Wednesday didn't respond further. Her mind drifted back to what she was thinking about earlier. Luke. She had never mentioned Luke to her parents, let alone the connection they shared. She didn't want their relationship compared to the perfect story of dark romance her parents embodied. What would she do when Luke arrived at the dance? Nothing. Both of them were very distant in public. Neither liked showing affection in front of others. So she could keep hiding her relationship with Luke from her parents. They could ignore each other all night, and by the next day it would be as if nothing had happened. The only problem was the talkative hand thing. Despite being just a hand, he was quite gossipy and could end up saying too much. He knew about her relationship with Luke. Even though Thing had sworn loyalty to her, she didn't fully trust that he'd keep quiet, especially with her father. So, to make sure her parents didn't find out about her and Luke, she locked Thing in a drawer. Did you make any friends at Nevermore? Wednesday, Morticia asked with some expectation. Gomez also looked at her eagerly. Throughout the year, the letters they received from Wednesday contained fewer than 10 words. She barely told them anything about her school life. The most she had told them was about the lunar eclipse. Only mentioning that she was staying to recover Goody Adams' book, their family ancestor. Friends, Wednesday repeated with a biting tone, letting the word hang in the air for a moment. No, I have no friends to introduce to you, Wednesday replied in a definitive tone. Though aside from Luke, she did have Eugene. She considered him more like a little brother and protected him, but he could be counted as a friend. My dear, it's inevitable to meet certain kindred spirits in places like Nevermore. There are bonds that simply can't be avoided. Like ours, Morticia said softly, glancing at Gomez for a moment. Wednesday maintained her composure, not letting her expression reveal anything. There is nothing, she repeated, her tone unchanged. Then she looked away, as if the conversation no longer interested her. What a shame. I thought she'd find a friend or someone special at Uck, thought Morticia, her expression slightly saddened. She knew the attack had been aimed at Luke Poe, so she thought that during that chaotic battle, her daughter might have grown closer to the boy. Morticia, Gomez and the entire outcast community were very curious to see and possibly meet the boy who possessed 3 Oris and had killed 2 Spellmonts, and the servant of more than 100 years, Atlas. Many families of the students were searching for Luke Poe, asking their children where the boy was who had caused Elliot Spellmont to leave the Triumvirate. Chapter 130, Raven 2, 7:55 p.m. Luke was sitting in Principal Larissa's office on a comfortable couch while playing a MOBA game on his phone. Next to him was Natasha, chatting with Larissa, who was wearing an elegant white suit with exquisite details. 5 minutes until the Raven starts. I have to go now since I'll be giving a brief speech. I'll see you there, said Larissa, standing up as she glanced at the time on her pocket watch. Remember, Luke, put on the suit, said Larissa, leaving a fully prepared suit in a transparent cover on Luke's couch. You're the star of tonight, she added with a slight smile. Do I really have to wear this? Asked Luke, who had just been defeated because of a troll on his team. You need to wear white clothes, but if you want you can use something from your own wardrobe, Larissa said, taking the suit back, but Luke stopped her. All right, I'll wear this suit, thanks, he said, taking the suit for himself. Larissa smiled and left the office after saying goodbye. You've become a lot kinder compared to when you first arrived at Nevermore, Natasha commented once they were alone in the office. Well, Larissa always helps us when she can. She'll let us stay at Nevermore a bit longer until we find a way to Ohio, Luke said. Standing up and grabbing the suit, Natasha nodded slightly. It was good that her master wasn't a spoiled child. And you, I don't see that the clothes you're wearing are white, said Luke. Natasha was dressed in black jeans, a leather jacket, and a plain black shirt. That's easily fixed, said Natasha, and in a matter of seconds her clothes changed on their own. She was now wearing a plain white dress that reached her knees. Even her shoes had changed to high heels. That's a great ability. You'll never have to spend money on clothes again, Luke commented enviously. Get changed, or we'll be late, Natasha said, hurrying Luke. Are you staying here? Luke asked as he took the suit out of its cover. He wanted some privacy. It was already strange enough to change in the school principal's office. Natasha smiled slightly and decided to hold back a teasing remark since they were running late. She got up from the couch and left the office. A few minutes later, Luke walked out of the office already changed. Natasha looked at him with curiosity. It was the first time she had seen Luke dress so elegantly. Luke's tuxedo was a pristine white, tailor-made, with a red bow tie at the neck that stood out elegantly against the light fabric. A white carnation was pinned to the lapel of the suit. The only black item he wore was his leather shoes. It suits him well, thought Natasha as she observed Luke. The contrast with his light brown hair and blue eyes made him stand out even more, and the white color accentuated his height, which had reached 182 centimeters. However, Natasha didn't say anything. It wasn't her style to compliment others. Shall we go? Luke asked, raising an eyebrow as he looked at Natasha, who had been silently staring at him for several seconds. Yes, let's go, Natasha said, starting to walk toward the ballroom. When they arrived at the double doors, Luke stopped Natasha, who was about to open them. Without offering any explanation, he placed his ear against the door to listen more closely. Larissa is giving the speech. This will be a good time to enter, Luke thought as he opened the door as slowly and quietly as possible. He really doesn't like being the center of attention, Natasha thought, following Luke. Thanks to how stealthy they were and the fact that everyone was listening and looking toward the center of the stage, no one noticed Luke's arrival as he quickly made his way to an empty table in the corner. However, the place was full of outcasts with enhanced senses. They noticed the intrusion of two new people. Several turned their gazes from the stage to look at Luke. That's your friend Luke, right? Vincent asked, looking at Luke from 3 tables away. Yes, that's him, Xavier replied with a strange expression. He knew Luke, his best friend, and he must be hating all the attention he was getting. His appearance is good, so is his aura, commented Steinan. Well, it's to be expected from the boy who killed Atlas, he added with a certain tone of respect. Even he hadn't lived more than 100 years like Atlas. Several murmurs about Luke's arrival were spreading across all the tables. So much for your stealth, Natasha remarked, sipping from her glass. She didn't care about the stares or the attention Luke was receiving. In fact, she thought it was a good thing. I forgot everyone here is superhuman, Luke muttered to himself. That's all, thank you for listening. Let the dance begin and enjoy the night, Larissa said, ending her speech. The music started playing again. Luke began to drink and eat the snacks in the center of his table. Within minutes, he was interrupted by a group of people approaching him. Sorry to interrupt your meal, it's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Vincent Thorpe. Xavier has told me a lot about you. My name is Steinan Petropoulos. A pleasure to meet you, young man. Both men, who appeared young but were already over 40, extended their hands to greet Luke, who softened his expression upon realizing they were the parents of his 2 best friends. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Thorpe and Mr. Petropoulos, said Luke, standing up from his seat and shaking hands with both men. Don't be so formal. You are a friend of my son. Call me Vincent, same here. Just call me Steinan. All right, Luke nodded. After that, both men noticed Natasha, who was calmly sipping her drink and seemed more flustered than when they saw Luke. They quickly began introducing themselves to her. Meanwhile, Luke started chatting with Xavier, Ajax, and the latter's younger brother. Ajax's older brother had already met up with some old-school friends. Is it true you turned the Spellman brothers into a ball of flesh? Asked Ajax's younger brother. His name was Acido, and he was a year younger than Ajax. Like Ajax, he wore a wool hat on his head to keep his snakes from getting out of control and turning everyone who looked at them to stone. Yeah, why? Luke asked, raising an eyebrow. Oh, so the rumors are true, said Acido, clenching his fists with excitement for some reason. There's a rumor going around Nevermore that if someone bothers a student from Ravenloft dorm, you'll show up at night and turn them into a grotesque ball of blood, Acido explained. Since Acido belongs to Ravenloft dorm the same as Luke, he feels respect and admiration for Luke, unlike the other dorms, which feel more fear towards him, believing Luke might harm them for being from a rival dorm. There was a great rivalry between dorms, which could be seen in the Po-Cup and other competitions held throughout the year. Stop bothering and go hang out with your friends, Ajax said, starting to push his brother, who complained but had no choice but to leave. You've got some fans, and it's not even because of your novels, Xavier commented with a smile. It's better to have Acido as a fan than the fans of my novels, Luke replied, taking a sip of his drink. The fans of his books were usually very enthusiastic and often violated his personal space. On the other hand, the fans he had at Nevermore were due to his reputation for killing enemies, so their admiration was more out of respect for his strength and fear of him. They didn't approach him asking for photos or autographs. By the way, aren't you going to dance with your goth girlfriend? Xavier asked with a slight smile, looking toward a table further away. Her dress is really cool, although she didn't stick to the event's color theme, Ajax added, also looking at the peculiar Addams family table. Luke looked over at Wednesday's table and noticed she was wearing the black dress she wore in the series. It suited her well, and her lips were painted black. Wednesday noticed Luke's gaze and looked at him for a second before quickly averting her eyes. She didn't want to give any signals that might make her parents start asking annoying questions. Don't come, I don't want my parents to know about us, Wednesday said through their telepathic link, without giving any further explanation. Fine, Luke replied. He couldn't deny that he was disappointed since he wanted to meet the Addams family not just because they were his in-laws, but because of the series. But he already expected this development from Wednesday. She hates being compared to her parents and doesn't want to have a romantic story like theirs. Or rather, she doesn't want them to be right, since she found love at Nevermore just like they did. I don't like dancing, and Wednesday doesn't want to introduce me to her parents, Luke explained in response to the looks from Ajax and Xavier. She doesn't want to introduce you to her family. Ajax and Xavier said in unison, exchanging puzzled looks. Luke nodded slightly, not giving it much importance. At this, Xavier and Ajax looked at each other again and shrugged. They knew about the strange relationship between Luke and Wednesday. Few people knew they were a couple. As they never showed any affection in public, they were often seen together during breaks and weekends, but no one was certain if they were actually dating. Xavier and Ajax, Luke's close friends, knew about it, but even they had never seen the couple show any affection, whether through kisses, hugs, or even words. "What are you doing over the vacations?" Luke asked, changing the subject. He didn't care what others thought about his relationship with Wednesday. He didn't need to show affection in public for people to know she was his girlfriend. When he's alone with her, he can kiss her and do other things, although of course it's not the same number of kisses and affectionate gestures as in a normal couple. "The same as always," Ajax replied, not very enthusiastic about his vacation. "The best part is not having homework and exams. But the downside is being far from his friends." "Same here. Hopefully, if my dad gets time off, we can go to Europe or something," Xavier added. "And you?" he asked. Before Luke could respond, Vincent, who had been talking to Natasha, joined their conversation. "You can come to our house, Luke. Of course, if you want to and if this lovely lady permits it," he added, glancing at Natasha with a charming smile. "Really, even despite," Luke said without finishing the sentence. He left it implied, and Vincent knew what he meant. "Yes, even despite those bold psychics," Vincent said. "It'll just be my son's friend coming to my house. Nothing more, and of course, as our guest, it's our duty to ensure your protection." "Oh, that would be great," Xavier said, excited about the idea. It would be so much fun to spend the summer with Luke. As for the Spellmans, he wasn't afraid of them. He had returned during the blood moon to help his friend. "Hey Vincent, don't get ahead of me. The Petropolis family is also inviting you to our mansion. I'm sure you'll love our statue gardens," Steinan said. And this time Ajax seemed happy about the idea of spending the summer with a friend. As for spending the summer together, it's complicated since the Petropolis and Thorpe families live in different states. Luke was surprised by this. Both were inviting him to their homes despite knowing that the Spellmans could attack or create a rift between their families and them. "Is it because of my 3 Oris?" Luke thought. That and the strength he showed when killing Atlas, Sebastian, and Sabrina, real name, Ingrid. "I appreciate the invitation, but it's not the best time to discuss that. We'll decide later," Natasha responded with a professional smile. As if she had already expected this outcome. "You're right, tonight is for having fun," Vincent said, politely bidding farewell and heading to another table to greet more acquaintances. Steinan also said goodbye and left the table. Luke chatted a bit more with Xavier and Ajax about possible vacations. But then his friends went off to dance with their partners, who seemed annoyed after being ignored for almost 20 minutes since the dance began. A few minutes later, Veronica approached the table with her parents, Luke's aunt and uncle. They greeted him briefly and told him that he could spend the summer at the Umbrio estate again if he wished. Then they said goodbye and returned to their tables. It was the first time Luke saw his uncle speaking more respectfully and without a furrowed brow while looking at him. "Surprised? It's normal for them to want to help you after learning that you possess 3 Oris. Do you know how many living psychics have 3 Oris besides you? 0. Though there may be some hidden monsters with 3 Oris, I doubt they came about naturally like you. But being the only one with 3 Oris publicly places you in a new situation that will be very useful to us," Natasha said with a slight smile. Luke nodded. They had to take advantage of this to buy more time. If he spends the holidays with the Umbrio, Thorpe or Petropolis families, it's less likely that the Spellmans will attack, and if they do, he will have the help of these families. It won't just be him, Natasha, and Wednesday. While he was conversing with Natasha, a man arrived at one point, introduced himself, and turned out to be a council member who invited Natasha to dance. Because of the connections and maybe in the future it will be useful to use this man, Natasha said telepathically to Luke as she stood up and accompanied the man to the dance floor. He belongs to one of the 66 council members, Luke thought as he watched Natasha and the man walk away. It's not easy at all to be one of the 66 representatives. One thing is to work for the council in one of the available departments or in the bureaucratic side if you're one of the 66 representatives. It means your family is powerful, and you are powerful too, as you are the leader of that family representing it in the council. You don't work for Congress, you establish the rules or influence them. Your position of power is higher. What now? Luke wondered. His two friends were dancing with their partners, his housekeeper was also dancing, and his girlfriend didn't want to talk to him because she didn't want to introduce him to her parents. Chapter 131, Raven 3. Luke started another match in the MOBA game on his phone. He had nothing better to do, he would just wait until the boring dance was over, and then head back to his room. Luke, someone called him at one point. He looked up and noticed a beautiful blonde girl staring at him with her green eyes. Cat a bangle, Luke said. Recognizing the blonde, it was about a previous girl he dated. Though they had only slept together, their relationship never had any real depth. You remember my name, Kat said with a happy smile when she heard Luke say her full name. Thanks to my eidetic memory. Luke replied, turning his attention back to his phone screen. Oh right, Kat said, a bit embarrassed. By the way, do you want to dance? She asked after a few seconds. Dance, Luke repeated, not really paying attention. He was at a crucial moment in his match. And if he won, he'd rank up. Yeah, dance, we could win the contest and be chosen king and queen. Do you want to? Kat asked, fidgeting with her hands. She had always been the popular one, and it felt strange for her to be in this position, where she had to wait for an answer and make the first move. Luke didn't know that even outcasts had adopted the stupidity of prom king and queen. Maybe it was the new generation. As for dancing, he didn't want to, since he hated it and had a girlfriend. How should he respond? He could tell her he had a girlfriend. But Wednesday wanted to keep it hidden from her parents, and it wouldn't help if he went around telling everyone she was his girlfriend. I don't want to. I don't like dancing, Luke replied after a few seconds. Really? I'm sure you'd dance well. I can teach you. Kat insisted, making Luke curse her persistence internally. No thanks, he said definitively, and Kat went back to the table with her friends, defeated. It was the first time she had been rejected, and she never thought rejection would feel like that. She had turned down many guys. And maybe in the future, she'd need to be kinder when rejecting them. Unfortunately for Luke, Kat wasn't the only girl who asked him to dance. More girls approached him, asking if he wanted to dance together. Luke had to turn down all the invitations. Some rejections were more curt, since he didn't know the girls, while others were gentler. For example, Rose, a psychic classmate with a green aura, invited him, and he turned her down with much more tact. Wednesday, who was sitting a few tables away from Luke, watched as different girls approached him to talk. Without realizing it, her brow furrowed, and she couldn't take her eyes off Luke's table. Why is he giving her so many explanations? Wednesday thought as she watched Luke talking to Rose until the latter finally left. That boy is popular, Morticia commented. Following Wednesday's gaze toward the table where Luke was sitting, a spark of curiosity ignited in Morticia. Why was her daughter looking at that table with a furrowed brow? She never frowned. Could Wednesday be hiding something? It's normal. He has 3 auras. Many families must be willing to lend a hand to such extraordinary talent, Gomez said in a more serious tone than usual. Many people were paying attention to Luke, who was playing on his phone and rejecting invitations to dance. Lineage is a very serious matter for psychics. To this day, arranged marriages still exist. Everyone would want a son-in-law with 3 auras. That would ensure their descendants have 2 auras, guaranteeing a golden age for the next generation. As for the Spellmans, psychic families might be willing to risk facing them. The rewards are great. They would gain a person with 3 auras who had already killed Atlas and 2 Spellman descendants. They would be up against an ancient family, and Luke could become a powerhouse in the future if he fully develops his abilities. Besides, outcasts never feared conflict. If the rewards were worth it, they wouldn't hesitate to go to war. That said, only if the odds of winning or surviving were decent. They couldn't gamble with their family's fate. It's true, the whole story around him must attract a lot of girls. Not just psychics. The most appealing thing about him must be that he killed 2 Spellman descendants, turning them into balls of meat, right, Wednesday? Morticia asked with a smile, staring intently at her daughter. Wednesday remained silent. She knew she had made a mistake. Her mother already suspected something and wouldn't stop until she confirmed her suspicions. Without saying a word, Wednesday stood up from her chair and began walking at a steady pace toward Luke's table, under the watchful eyes of her parents, brother, and other tables that noticed her movement. The family members and students at the table murmured, wondering if the Adams girl with the unfriendly expression was going to ask Luke to dance like the others. Will she succeed? Asked a girl, a friend of Kat's, as she watched Wednesday get closer to her target. Of course not, said Kat, shaking her head. Why not? Luke Poe is always seen with that Adams girl, and with that Thorpe guy and the Gorbin boy, commented a tall guy. Morticia and Gomez exchanged surprised looks at their daughter's behavior. They had expected her to give her usual response that it was all stupid and that she wasn't interested in such trivial things. Pugsley, who had been mumbling to himself, also looked at his sister, surprised by her unusual behavior. "Hey," said Wednesday, stopping in front of Luke, who was staring at his phone screen. With the music playing and being absorbed in his game, he didn't recognize Wednesday's voice and assumed it was another girl asking him to dance. He already felt strange rejecting so many girls. It seemed like the roles had reversed, and it made him feel like some kind of damsel. "I don't want to dance," Luke said without looking up. "Neither do I," Wednesday echoed. This time, Luke recognized the emotional tone of his girlfriend and looked up. A bit surprised to see her standing in front of him, staring directly at him. Didn't she want to keep their relationship hidden? He noticed the Adams family watching them. Is she upset? Luke wondered, raising an eyebrow as he noticed Wednesday's furrowed brow. "I thought you wanted to keep." Before Luke could finish his sentence, Wednesday stepped forward, leaning over him. Without warning, she kissed him, her black painted lips meeting his in a quick but determined motion. One of her hands rested on Luke's cheek, while the other clung to the collar of his suit. The crowd went silent for a moment. Even those dancing stopped, all eyes turning to Luke's table, unable to look away from the unexpected scene. Luke, still stunned by the sudden display of affection, returned the kiss. Though part of him was still trying to process what was happening, the Adams family, watching from a nearby table, shared a rare expression of surprise. Morticia, for the first time in a long while, raised her eyebrows, unable to hide her astonishment. She had thought her daughter would deny any interest in the Poe boy. The last thing she expected was for her to walk over and kiss him like that in front of everyone. Gomez, usually delighted by any peculiarity from his daughter, was momentarily in shock, his mouth slightly open. Only after a few seconds did he react, a smile beginning to form on his lips. Pugsley blinked, unable to fully process what he was witnessing. It was as if the whole world had taken an unexpected turn and someone else had possessed his sister. When Wednesday finally pulled away, her dark eyes met Lucas. Her expression remained as impassive as ever. But there was a faint glint of possession in her gaze. "You're mine," Wednesday said in her usual monotone, devoid of emotion, but with a firmness that made it feel like she had just marked her territory. Luke, still surprised, blinked, unsure how to react. Yeah," he murmured, nodding slightly. He was getting destroyed in an online League of Legends match, and suddenly, this happened. Everyone in the hall continued to stare at them. Murmurs began to rise among the students and families who had witnessed the scene. Luke felt strange. He had rejected so many girls that night, as if he were the damsel waiting to be asked to dance, and now, to top it all off, he had been kissed by his girlfriend in a dominant way. "Why do I feel like the damsel?" Luke thought irritably, standing up from his chair and looking at Wednesday, who followed him with her gaze. Before she could say anything more, he grabbed her by the waist and pulled her close. This time, he was the one who kissed her. The crowd, which had been murmuring, fell silent once again. Pugsley began muttering to himself at high speed. Why isn't she pushing him away? Why didn't she stab him? The kiss was intense, and when they pulled apart, Luke looked at Wednesday with a small satisfied smile. "Any complaints? If you can kiss me out of nowhere, I can do it too," Luke said. "Fine, I'll allow you that privilege." "But only once a day," Wednesday replied, pulling a chair close to Lucas and sitting down. "Oh, now I can kiss you whenever I want?" Luke asked, sitting next to her. "Yes, but only once," Wednesday answered. "If I don't use it one day, do I get two the next day?" Luke asked. "No, it's not cumulative," Wednesday responded. "I tried," Luke thought. He had managed to get something good. Usually, the kisses he shared with Wednesday were few and only in situations that warranted them, since she liked to have her space, and she was not one of the girls who kissed her boyfriend countless times in one day. Now he could kiss her whenever he pleased, even if she was writing her novel or practicing with her cello. "Ha ha ha, my little viper, it seems you've hidden this secret from us quite well." Chapter 132, Raven 4. "Ha ha ha, my little viper, it seems you've hidden this secret from us very well." Luke turned his gaze toward the voice. Gomez Adams had a particular presence, relaxed, almost carefree, but with an overwhelming weight that filled the air. There was something dangerous about him. "He's strong," Luke thought, his brow furrowing slightly. It was the first time he had felt such intense pressure from someone. Not even with the teachers or Ajax and Xavier's parents had he experienced anything like this. Even with Atlas, he had never felt such a thing. He could sense that the Gorgon was powerful. But Atlas didn't instill the same fear or pressure in him that Gomez did. "Darling, every day you become more skilled at hiding your emotions," Morticia remarked softly, her eyes sliding from Wednesday to Luke, as if studying their every movement from her daughter's comments. Morticia had assumed that Wednesday rejected any form of friendship, let alone something as unlikely as romance. When Wednesday was younger, Morticia could read the emotions behind her expressionless mask, but over the years, that wall had become almost impenetrable. "However, today, you didn't hide them so well, did you?" Morticia continued. "It's curious, isn't it, how love and a bit of jealousy can transform a person," she added with a soft laugh, narrowing her eyes with a spark of amusement. "Jealousy," Luke repeated in a low tone. With that he understood Wednesday's behavior, though it was hard to believe. Could it be that Wednesday was upset by the girls who had asked him to dance? Was it possible that she had become jealous? "Don't pay attention to her insinuations, Luke," Wednesday interrupted in her usual cold tone. "It's not jealousy, Mother, it's possession. Why allow others to approach what's already mine? To avoid unnecessary problems in the future, I decided there's no point in hiding my relationship with Luke anymore," Wednesday concluded, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Luke nodded slightly at the comment that sounded more like Wednesday. Rationality, not simple jealousy. During the time he spent with Wednesday, he hadn't noticed any sign of jealousy, no matter how much he talked with another girl, very different from Enid, who had openly shown jealousy on several occasions during their relationship. Gomez, who had been listening with a twisted smile, broke the silence with a loud laugh. "My little one is quite the strategist. Now that's love, the kind that moves mountains, or destroys anyone in its way." "Of course," he added, his eyes gleaming with pride. Wednesday glanced at her father, disagreeing with his comment, but said nothing. She knew that anything she said would be useless against her father. "A pleasure to meet you. I've heard a lot of rumors about you." "Gomez Adams, father of this little reaper," Gomez said, extending his hand toward Luke. Wednesday's eyebrows twitched slightly at being called Little Reaper in front of Luke, but she remained silent. "A pleasure to meet you, sir. Luke Poe," Luke said, introducing himself respectfully. Quite different from his usual tone, as he extended his hand. They shared a strong handshake. "Good grip, you're not a weakling," Gomez said with a laugh, giving Luke a rough pat on the shoulder. Luke allowed Gomez to do this and only offered a faint smile. Wednesday found Luke's behavior strange, but said nothing. She just wanted her parents to leave so she could be alone with Luke, but that wasn't going to happen. For some reason, Luke wanted to get along with Gomez, not just because he was his girlfriend's father. Though that was part of it, he couldn't quite explain it, but he wanted to earn the respect of this man who seemed very strong. After that, Morticia introduced herself in a much more polite and elegant manner, in stark contrast to her loud and enthusiastic husband. "Tarora is quite unique too," Luke thought, observing Morticia carefully. Morticia was a beautiful woman who seemed like the adult version of Wednesday, with a few differences. For one, her height. She stood almost 1.80 meters tall, making her much taller than average. In contrast, Wednesday was short compared to the average, having inherited that trait from her father. Morticia radiated elegance, with a serene but proud smile on her face. Her expression was very different from her daughter's, who maintained her usual cold and impenetrable demeanor. While Morticia was kind in her gestures, Wednesday was distant, with biting remarks that repelled anyone who tried to get close. Another minor detail Luke noticed about Morticia was that her nails were painted blood red. He thought that since the family liked everything dark, she would have painted them black like her daughter. "Pugsley dear, introduce yourself to your sister's boyfriend," Morticia said softly, turning to her son, who stood still, murmuring to himself. Pugsley slowly lifted his head, dark circles under his eyes and an air of exhaustion about him. He seemed to be in a state of shock since discovering that his sister had a boyfriend. To Pugsley, the idea was incomprehensible. Wednesday had always been cold to him, almost inhuman in her psychopathy. He had never imagined her forming a romantic relationship with anyone, much less with someone like Luke, who looked so normal in that ugly white suit. Luke's charming appearance reminded him of the popular jocks who always bullied him at school. He whispered something under his breath, unintelligible words that were barely discernible. He was clearly uncomfortable, not only with the situation but with what it represented. His sister, that relentless and distant figure, was now connected to someone. Gomez, noticing the tension in his son, gave him a hearty pat on the back and pulled a cigar from his inner pocket. offering it to him with a wide smile. "Come on, kid, this will relax you. You don't discover every day that your sister has a boyfriend," he joked with his typical booming laughter. Pugsley took the cigar with a trembling hand. His eyes darted from Luke to Wednesday and then back to Luke. As his gaze wandered between them, his other hand, almost automatically, reached into his pants pocket and pulled out an old lighter, one of those heavy metal ones with engraved details. With nervous shaking fingers, Pugsley flicked open the lighter's lid with a snap. The small flame flickered in the air as he lit the cigar, murmuring softly, "I don't get it." A pubescent boy smoking a cigar as if nothing, Uncle Luke thought with a strange expression. "He's always a bit withdrawn. Once he finishes his cigar, he'll be fine," Morticia said, sitting in one of the chairs next to Gomez, close to Luke and Wednesday. "Want one?" Gomez asked, offering a cigar to Luke. Luke looked at the cigar Gomez extended. He hesitated for a second. He had never smoked in his life, neither in this one nor in his previous one. But saying no in front of the Adams, that would make him look weak. A brat like Pugsley next to him was smoking like a mafia boss, and he couldn't afford to fall behind. With a small gesture of determination, Luke took the cigar, feeling its weight and texture between his fingers. Gomez offered him his lighter, and Luke, with an air of forced confidence, lit it. He took the first puff with a false bravado, trying to maintain his composure. The thick, heavy smoke from the cigar filled his lungs almost immediately, much denser than he had imagined. He tried to hold it in, but it was only a few seconds before a strong cough broke the silence. He coughed several times. Pugsley, who had been watching in silence, let out a small mocking smile. Luke, still coughing, glanced at him out of the corner of his eye. He wasn't warming up to Wednesday's brother very much. "Everything okay, kid?" Gomez asked, laughing at the scene without malice as he took a long drag from his own cigar. "I'm fine," Luke replied, clearing his throat. "You shouldn't have accepted. I never saw you smoking a cigarette. A cigar isn't the same as a cigarette," Wednesday said, having remained silent until that moment. In her words, there was a slight hint of concern hidden in her tone. Only Morticia noticed, smiling slightly but saying nothing. "It's nothing. It's just a matter of getting used to it. I've killed a gorgon over 100 years old. A cigar is nothing," Luke boasted, referencing one of his accomplishments. "Do what you want," Wednesday replied with her usual coldness. She didn't understand why Luke wanted to show off in front of her family. She had never seen Luke boast about his accomplishments so openly. It was a part of him she didn't know. He was proud and had a certain arrogance, but he rarely expressed it in words. Rather, his confidence emanated from his actions. "Oh, the Gorgon Atlas fell at your hands. Tell us more about that thrilling battle. I've always wanted to know the details of such death fights," Gomez said excitedly. Under Gomez's expectant gaze, Luke felt a new surge of pride and decided to share the story of his battle against Atlas. He had never been this talkative when meeting new people, not even when he met Enid's parents. When he finished the story, Natasha returned to the table. She introduced herself to the Adams family and sat down. Gomez and Morticia were very talkative and could easily draw out conversation topics, even if they were strange ones. At one point, Gomez and Morticia invited them to spend the holidays at the Adams mansion. "We have plenty of rooms. It's been a long time since we had guests. I'm sure you little viper will agree, right?" Gomez said, looking at Wednesday. In a normal situation, Wednesday would have refused immediately. The last thing she wanted was for her parents to see her with Luke in an intimate way all summer. However, she wasn't in a normal situation. She had agreed to follow Luke to Ohio in search of the evidence his parents had hidden. They couldn't leave immediately, as doing so would have the entire Spellman family attacking them, and that would be like suicide. Being in her mansion ensured them a safe place to plan how to get to Ohio, as it was unlikely the Spellmans would dare to attack with her father, mother, uncle, and grandmother there. Plus, the Adams mansion had its own protections. The most rational thing was to go to her house to plan properly how to get to Ohio. "I'm fine with that," Wednesday said, surprising both Morticia and Luke, who thought she would reject the idea. Gomez, who wasn't thinking too deeply about his beloved daughter's thoughts, smiled widely. "Haha, then it's decided. It will be an honor to be invited to the ancient Adams mansion," Natasha said, then looked at Luke. "The Adams are more powerful than the Thorpes and the Petropolis. They belong to the Six Greats. It's best to go with them," Natasha said to Luke through their telepathic link. The Six Greats referred to the six most powerful and ancient psychic families in America's marginalized society. Although there were currently 5, as one of them was the Poe Fallen family, in that group were the Adams and the Spellmans. The Umbrio did not belong to the group. "Okay, thanks for having us," Luke said in agreement. What he wanted most was to visit the famous Adams mansion. Better yet if Wednesday agreed. After that, the Addams family went to chat with some old friends. They were strange, but they held a great status in the outcast society. Chapter 133, The Dance. Raven 5. The Raven continued. Luke enjoyed the event with Wednesday, who was in a good mood to chat about various topics. The only annoying thing was having Pugsley's gaze fixed on him the entire night. The boy smoked his cigar in silence, just watching and murmuring to himself. He was even more surprised to see how his sister chatted with Luke all night. Let's just ignore him, Luke thought, turning all his attention back to Wednesday. He looked at her elegant black dress. What? Wednesday asked, noticing that Luke was staring at her. Her dark eyes were fixed on him, waiting for a reaction. She knew this dress wasn't the sort of thing people expected from her, and secretly she hoped he would comment on it. No one had forced her to buy this gothic dress. She could have come to the dance in her usual clothes, but she hadn't. Nice dress, Luke said, with a smile that was a mix of teasing and appreciation. He couldn't help it. It seemed odd that Wednesday, the master of disdain for social norms, had decided to buy a dress for a party. Really? Wednesday replied, frowning, her voice colder than usual. Is that your way of mocking me? She added, noticing the teasing tone in Luke's voice. No, I didn't mean it like that, Luke quickly said, raising his hands in a defensive gesture. I'm just surprised you bought a dress, considering you always look down on social events, he added to calm his girlfriend's anger. You're not exactly the most suited to say that, Wednesday replied, looking at Luke's white suit with a mocking smirk. At least she had chosen a gothic dress. She hadn't conformed to the attire everyone else was wearing at the dance. Let's just say I'm wearing this suit out of consideration for someone, Luke justified, shrugging. He didn't really care about dressing according to any particular event. At last year's Raven with Xavier and Ajax, he had dressed as expected, and for Halloween, he had also made an effort to wear a costume. Consideration. Now you're seeking someone's approval, Wednesday asked in a biting, disdainful tone. It was true that she had hoped Luke would compliment her dress, but that was different. He was her boyfriend after all. Come on, give me a break, Luke thought. He hadn't expected Wednesday to suddenly get so defensive. They'd been chatting peacefully up until now. Could it be because she thought he was mocking her dress instead of complimenting her? Let's go with Ulk, Luke thought. Maybe his previous comment had been misunderstood, and it was best to fix things right away. I'm sorry about what I said earlier. I didn't mean to make fun of your dress. It just seemed unusual. Besides, I had another thought I didn't, said Luke. And what would that thought be? Wednesday asked, slightly lowering her guard, though her gaze was still scrutinizing. That the dress looks incredibly good on you, Luke said with difficulty and sincerity. Also, Wednesday asked, raising an eyebrow, impatient to hear the rest of the compliment. Luke frowned, feeling unsure. Being completely open about his feelings wasn't really his thing. But at that moment, Wednesday already knew there was more. Her eyes, sharp as daggers, wouldn't let him escape. Ever since I walked into the dance, it's been really hard not to stare at you the whole time, Luke confessed with difficulty. It was like I was mesmerized by you. The distance between the tables only made the idea of getting closer more tempting. But I didn't because you didn't want your parents to know about us, he added. Wednesday's previously cold expression shifted slightly at Luke's compliment. She had never received such a direct, verbalized compliment from him. It felt oddly pleasant, like an achievement even harder than decapitating a hide. Now you can look at me all you want, and up close, Wednesday said, moving her chair closer to his. Then she placed her hand on Luke's cheek, forcing him to look her in the eyes. Thanks, Luke said, gazing intently at Wednesday's face. He noticed something that puzzled him. Is that a blush? Luke wondered, seeing the faintest hint of color on Wednesday's cheeks. It was barely noticeable. Her expression remained mostly blank. Though not as cold as before, Luke and Wednesday continued their conversation, much closer than before, not caring about anyone else around them. Pugsley watched them with wide eyes. He had witnessed the entire exchange between the couple. What had happened to his sister? Was she a double, or perhaps a shapeshifter? Neither of them paid any attention to Pugsley's perplexed and hostile stare. At a certain moment, the music in the hall softened, and the couples on the dance floor gradually came to a stop. The lights focused on Larissa, who was at the center of the stage, microphone in hand, highlighted by a white light as the center of attention. Thank you all for attending tonight's Raven, an event that celebrates the unity of our community, Larissa began, her tone formal yet warm. Tonight is special. Not just for the music or dancing, but for the camaraderie we share at Nevermore Academy. Camaraderie, give me a break, Luke said, sighing and rolling his eyes as he absently played with a dark strand of Wednesday's hair. Luke got along well with Larissa and considered her part of his small, close-knit circle of people he cared about. However, he disagreed with her on this. On the night of the lunar eclipse, none of these parents had come to defend Nevermore from the imminent attack. 99% of the students went home, though many were forced by their parents. Some, like Xavier, Ajax, Enid, Yuko and Divina, managed to escape from the buses. If there were a list of empty words, camaraderie would be in the top 5, Wednesday said in her monotone. Without taking her eyes off Larissa, Larissa continued, thanking the organizers and everyone who helped make the night possible. Finally, her voice took on a more enthusiastic tone. And now, the moment many of you have been waiting for. It's time to crown the king and queen of the Raven. This should be interesting, Luke said with a slight smile. Interesting? More like an insignificant exercise in collective ego. Wednesday replied, crossing her arms. Is it really necessary to exalt 2 individuals with useless crowns and ridiculous titles? The desire to be adored by strangers? Personally, I'd rather not have to deal with that, Luke said with a lazy expression. Wednesday nodded slowly. Crowd approval has always seemed pathetic to me. True satisfaction comes when one doesn't have to rely on such trivialities. Let's see which 2 idiots will have to smile and dance in front of the crowd, said Luke, already wanting to go to sleep. Natasha looked at the 2 young people with a strange expression as she sipped her wine. She didn't understand why they were so critical of a simple ceremony to choose the king and queen of the dance. It's a phase, she thought, shaking her head. At that moment, the organizers began handing out envelopes and pens to the guests, indicating it was time to vote for the Raven king and queen. Luke and Wednesday looked at the envelopes with a lack of interest in writing anything. They paid no attention to the dance floor and didn't know many people well enough to nominate anyone. Both wrote something random, more to go along with it than out of any real interest. After a few minutes, the envelopes were collected and taken to the stage, where the organizers began counting the votes. Luke and Wednesday immersed themselves back into their conversation, ignoring the process. When Larissa returned to the microphone, her voice echoed throughout the hall, capturing everyone's attention. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. This year's Raven King and Queen are... She paused dramatically as an assistant handed her a paper with the results, Luke Poe and Wednesday Adams. The room erupted in applause, and the lights immediately focused on their table. Luke blinked, clearly surprised. What the hell? Luke thought, confused as everyone stared at him, making him the sudden center of attention. Wednesday, for her part, maintained a stoic expression, unfazed by the applause she was receiving. Incredible, we've been condemned to be the monarchs of fools, Wednesday said in her usual dry tone. Is this even legal? Luke asked, bewildered. Neither of them had set foot on the dance floor. They shouldn't be able to be elected king and queen when they hadn't even danced. I don't know the rules of these dances. I suppose we can't refuse, can we? Wednesday said as she rose from her chair with calculated elegance. She's okay with this, Luke thought, unsure of how to act. He didn't want to go to the center of the stage, but refusing would only make the scene more awkward. It was best to end this charade as quickly as possible. Surely Wednesday thought the same. Luke stood up, and together with Wednesday walked toward the center of the stage. He noticed many of the boys from his dorm cheering him on as he passed by. Xavier and Ajax pointed to themselves and shook their heads, trying to indicate they hadn't voted for him. I guess it can't be helped, Luke thought. He was quite popular at Nevermore, and Wednesday had made a scene by kissing him in front of everyone. That alone made them the most striking couple of the night. Plus, Wednesday had her own reputation as an icy beauty. As they reached the center of the stage, a teacher placed a gold crown on Luke's head. From the weight and appearance, Luke suspected it might be real gold. Another teacher placed a tiara on Wednesday's head. Luke had a strange expression as he was crowned. Moments ago, he'd been criticizing and mocking the idiots who would be crowned, and now here he was, standing in front of everyone. Wednesday stared ahead, showing not a hint of emotion. Congratulations to our king and queen, said Larissa with a smile, handing the microphone to Luke to say a few words. Luke took the microphone, though he clearly had no idea what to say. Several seconds of complete silence passed as he looked out over the crowd, his eyes scanning the expectant faces. Well, I didn't expect this. I didn't know a couple that doesn't dance could be crowned king and queen of the ball, he began casually, which means there must have been some really bad dancing out there, he added with an awed expression. The room fell silent. and some people started exchanging awkward glances. Larissa, standing nearby, winced at his comment. Realizing too late how it sounded, Luke cleared his throat, trying to recover. I didn't mean it like that, but well, it seems like, Before the situation got worse, Larissa approached with a nervous smile and gently took the microphone from him. "Thank you, Luke, for those lovely words," she said quickly, passing the microphone to Wednesday, who took it but didn't say anything. She just held the microphone for a few seconds, looking at the audience with an indifferent expression. She noticed her parents watching her with enthusiastic expressions, as if they too had once been king and queen, which only made her more annoyed internally. Larissa took the microphone from Wednesday, internally frustrated but keeping a professional smile on her face. "Well, that concludes our coronation. Now, for the final dance to be led by our king and queen," she added as music began to play softly and the lights dimmed, focusing on the center of the dance floor. Now empty and ready for Luke and Wednesday to start the final dance of the night. "Let's go," Wednesday said in a low but firm voice. "Are we really going to dance?" Luke asked. "I'd call it more of a provocation than a dance," Wednesday replied, taking Luke's hand and walking toward the center of the floor. "What do you mean by provocation?" Luke asked, confused, recalling Wednesday's dance scene from the series, exaggerated and absurd movements, showing them that their choice was a poor one, and that next time, they should use their brains when voting. Wednesday responded. "Just follow my lead, you won't have to do much, which I know you prefer," she added, noticing that Luke was about to protest. Suddenly, Wednesday began to move in a completely unique and uninhibited way. Her movements were exaggerated, strange, almost grotesque on purpose. Her arms swung wildly, her body contorted in jerky motions, her feet twisted in unexpected steps. Everything about her mocked the very concept of a formal dance. She wasn't following any rhythm, she moved to her own beat, as if creating her own rebellious choreography. Meanwhile, Luke did exactly what he promised, barely moved. He took small steps, raising an arm every so often in a lazy motion. Each time Wednesday twirled, Luke followed her movement half-heartedly. He didn't try to be graceful, nor did he care to. But to the surprise of many, the combination of Wednesday's vibrant energy and Luke's indifference was, in its own way, captivating. The contrast between them was bewildering. Together, they looked like the opposite of what anyone would expect from a dance couple. As Wednesday continued her strange dance, Luke found himself focusing more on her, momentarily forgetting that he didn't like dancing. Watching her move, a small spark of interest began to light up within him. He started to synchronize his movements with hers just a little, though subtly. It wasn't hard to match her rhythm. Martial arts required far more control and agility than any dance. Wednesday noticed the change in Luke. Her lips barely curved into a satisfied smile, though her face remained impassive. She knew she'd managed to capture his interest, even if he wouldn't admit it. When the song ended, both stopped, thinking their performance had been nothing more than a mocking challenge to the formality of the dance. But what they hadn't expected was the audience's reaction. Suddenly, the entire hall erupted in applause. The cheers were deafening, and many of those present seemed genuinely impressed. The werewolves howled with enthusiasm, and the others weren't far behind. Luke and Wednesday, who had tried to provoke, exchanged a brief look, both surprised, even Wednesday, who hadn't expected her exotic dance to be accepted. The music started again, and this time everyone flooded onto the dance floor for one last dance with their partners. The floor was more crowded than ever, with many couples trying to replicate Wednesday and Luke's dance. A pair of werewolves began to move wildly, letting their impulses guide each step with ferocity. Others copied some of Wednesday's erratic movements, and a vampire couple danced with lazy arrogance, trying to imitate Luke. Luke watched the scene with a raised eyebrow, clearly amused. "Looks like we underestimated the power of strangeness among outcasts," he commented with an ironic smile. Wednesday nodded, her expression still serious, though there was a slight glint of approval in her eyes. Luke turned and was about to leave the hall. He had done his part as king, and even pushed himself to dance for the first time. He'd only done it for Wednesday, otherwise he would have disappeared with Shambles. "Who said this is over?" Wednesday asked, grabbing Luke by the sleeve as he turned with a look of slight frustration. "You want to keep dancing?" Luke asked, clearly unenthusiastic. It's not that he hadn't enjoyed the previous dance a little thanks to her, but he preferred not to repeat it if possible. That's not an option. Monarchs can't leave the dance floor before their subjects. Wednesday replied, taking Luke's hand. She dragged him toward the dance floor, which parted before them as if everyone recognized the arrival of the king and queen, and so the raven came to an end. very different from what Luke had expected, as he had met the Adams. His relationship with Wednesday became public, and he danced with her in front of everyone. Chapter 134. End of the school year. On Sunday, all the students got up early. Luke already had all his belongings packed, his clothes, console, MacBook, and other things. Xavier also had his luggage ready to go back home. It's strange to see the dorm empty, Xavier commented, zipping up his backpack and slinging it over his shoulder. Yeah, Luke said, sitting on the edge of his bed with a strange look in his eyes. His 10th grade had ended. It had been a crazy year for Luke, even more than the last one. Besides, it was likely he wouldn't be returning to Nevermore next year. They didn't know how long it would take to recover the evidence in Ohio or if they'd make it out alive. You seem a bit melancholic. Next year will be better. Let's hope it's a more normal year, without zombie attacks or serial killers on the loose in Jericho, Xavier said, patting Luke on the shoulder with a slight smile. Where's the fun in that? Luke asked with a slight smile, standing up. True, facing an army of zombies was pretty fun. It was like a video game, and then going up against those bastards, Xavier said, recalling their battle against Amaranth and Deacon. It wasn't a fair fight since there were 4 of them: Yoko, Diviner, Ajax, and him against 2. But fights are never fair, especially in the harsh society of the outcasts. Will you come visit my house? Wednesday is also invited, though I doubt she'd want to come, Xavier added. He already knew Luke would be going with the Adams family, but the invitation from the Thorpes was still open. They could spend a few days together at his place. He also invited Ajax, even if it wouldn't be for the entire vacation. It was better than nothing. I can't, Luke replied honestly. Why? Xavier asked, raising an eyebrow. Family matters, Luke answered, giving Xavier a knowing look. And Xavier understood what he meant. You can't take a break. All right, if you need any help, just let me know, Xavier said with a slight smile. He wouldn't hesitate to help his best friend. I'll call you if anything comes up, Luke said sincerely. He'd never had a friend he trusted as much as Xavier. Ajax also fell into that category. It took him over 2 years and several battles side by side to trust them. Luke levitated his luggage along with Xavier's, and they headed to the door. They left the room and began walking through the Ravenloft common room. Many students were carrying their luggage while chatting with their friends. Ajax, who was carrying several bags, saw them and started walking toward them. Behind him was his younger brother, Isidso, along with a few friends who were glancing at Luke. Sorry, Luke, my brother is really annoying, and he's your fan, Ajax said through the mental link he shared with Luke. Luke made a strange face at this comment. When Ajax arrived with Isidso, the latter's friends began introducing themselves to Luke one by one. I'm a huge fan of Salem's Lot. Please sign my book, one of Isidso's friends said, extending the book and a pen toward Luke. I'm a big fan of Kerry. She gave those normie bastards what they deserved. Please sign my book, exclaimed another, holding out his copy of Kerry to Luke. The other 2 also extended their respective books, asking him to sign. It's been a while since people came up to me asking for autographs, Luke thought as he looked at the 4 books held out to him. This was because he was a bit of a grouch, and many were afraid of him due to all the incidents he had been involved in, fights with older students, confrontations with powerful outcasts, and more. In the Ravenloft dormitory, he was respected for his strength and feared for his personality, as if he were a demon who would beat you up just for talking to him, thinking you were bothering him. Sure, Luke said in a friendly tone. He could be a bit more considerate with his fans, though it wasn't something he particularly enjoyed. Besides, it was the brother of one of his only friends. Isidso's friends, who were nervous about Luke's possible reaction, were very happy with his willingness. After he signed their books, they all wanted a handshake and chatted with him for about 5 minutes, asking questions about his next book, his interests, and so on. Luke was very patient and answered everything calmly, with no irritation in his voice. Xavier and Ajax were surprised by this. They weren't the only ones. Several students noticed the scene. When Isidso and his friends finally left Luke alone, other students felt encouraged to approach him, asking him to sign their books and chat, even if just for a few minutes. There were more fans than I imagined, Luke thought, somewhat surprised, as he signed books and shook hands. He didn't quite understand why the handshakes made his doormates so happy. Luke spent over 30 minutes signing books and talking with his doormates' fans. Finally, he was able to continue on his way with Xavier and Ajax toward the exit. I was surrounded by so many people, and nothing happened to me, Luke thought, with a barely perceptible smile on his face. When he first arrived at Nevermore and was recognized as Luke Poe, the writer of Kerry, he had been swarmed by many students, feeling a sensation of claustrophobia and discomfort. Fortunately, Enid had saved him. Now, that weakness he once considered pathetic no longer plagued him. "Who are you?" Ajax asked, giving him a cautious look. "Were you possessed by a ghost and now you're a kind person?" Xavier asked with a slight teasing smile. "Shut up, I can be nice for a day," Luke replied in an annoyed tone. It's not like he was never nice and was always grumpy and apathetic. Though the main reason he decided to reveal all the evidence earlier was for Wednesday, another reason involved the potential deaths of his fellow outcasts at the hands of the Spellmans. Crackstone, and possibly an army of thousands of undead. He didn't want his fellow outcasts to die in the crossfire because of his grudge and his crazy mortal enemies. Yeah, whatever you say," Xavier said as they left the dorm and began walking through the halls of Nevermore toward the main door. "Excited to live in your girlfriend's house?" Ajax asked, clearly curious. "I don't know," Luke began. On one hand, he was excited to see the Adams mansion and get to know the family in depth. As for living with Wednesday, he wasn't sure how it would work. They were both very independent, and he didn't know how she felt about him living in her house. It was a big step, and they had taken it rather quickly due to the circumstances they were in. The three friends continued talking along the way about their romantic situations. Xavier and Ajax hadn't had much luck with their dates from the Raven, but they still held out hope of finding the right girl. They arrived at the main entrance, where several parents had come to pick up their children. There were also several buses lined up to take students home. Ajax and Xavier said goodbye to Luke and went off to meet their parents, who were already waiting for them. Luke noticed Natasha walking toward him. She wore a black tank top with jeans and leather sneakers. "Happy to be done with the school year?" Natasha asked. Stopping near Luke, "I don't think," Luke replied, looking at Nevermore's gothic structure. "He might not be back here for quite some time." "Are you feeling sad?" "That's new. I thought you hated schools, like those kids who self-diagnose with depression," Natasha said with a teasing smile. "Of course not," Luke immediately denied. "It's just that, just when I get special protection, I might not be coming back to Nevermore," he added with a frustrated expression. He had risked his life and spent months gathering evidence to make sure the Spellmans would be punished for the attempted murder against him through a massive attack on Nevermore. One of the rewards he obtained was that, as long as he was at Nevermore, the Spellmans couldn't try to kill him again. Actually, they can, but if they are discovered, they will be severely punished by the Council. So it's very likely he could have had a normal year at Nevermore, or maybe not, but the assassination attempts wouldn't be as brutal and blatant as in the past 2 years. "Maybe we'll accomplish our goal before vacation ends, and you can start 11th grade at Nevermore," Natasha said, resting a hand on her chin. What she wanted most was for Luke to have as normal a life as possible and to train intensely, without the risk of being killed. That way, he could get stronger, and their chances of winning would increase. "However, I doubt they'll leave you alone even if you're here. They attacked Nevermore on a large scale, and they won't stop until they kill you. They're too eager to do so, and a warning with the threat of punishment won't stop them," Natasha added, and Luke nodded, although staying at Nevermore was still a much safer option than going to Ohio with Natasha and Wednesday, where they could be attacked freely by who knows how many Spellman members. Without further delay, Luke and Natasha walked toward Nevermore's main entrance. Looking for the Adams family, Wednesday stood motionless, watching the road in front of the school, surrounded by tall trees. Next to her, her luggage was neatly and meticulously placed, an immaculate black suitcase and a simple matching backpack. The only movement came from her brother, Pugsley, who was playing with a snake about 30 centimeters long. He was amused, dodging the small reptile's quick bites, which was clearly irritated, but this didn't seem to bother Pugsley. "Where did he get a snake?" Luke wondered as he approached. "Hey, where are your parents?" Luke asked, addressing Wednesday directly. Her eyes stayed fixed on the street for a moment before she slowly turned her head towards him, her expression still impassive. Despite seeing her boyfriend for the first time that day, not even a slight smile broke her usual stoic demeanor. They went on a date to Jericho Cemetery. They wanted to see all the graves that were disturbed by the dark ritual Atlas performed, Wednesday replied in her monotone voice. Luke nodded, unsurprised. For Gomez and Morticia, a date like that at 8 in the morning would be completely normal. They were probably at the cemetery since dawn. Natasha, who had been listening to the conversation in silence, stepped forward and grabbed Luke's floating luggage. "I'll go put your luggage in the car," Natasha said before disappearing with it in seconds, leaving the two of them alone. She had a car to follow the Adams family. Pugsley had stopped playing with the snake and was now squinting at Luke with a look full of distrust. It was obvious he wasn't thrilled about Luke's presence, much less that he was dating his sister. Jealous over his sister? Luke thought, noticing the poorly disguised hostility in the boy's gaze. An amusing idea crossed his mind. He remembered the incident from the night before, when Pugsley had looked smug as Luke coughed after trying a cigar. Time for a little revenge, Luke thought, smiling inwardly as he stepped close to Wednesday, stopping just a few inches from her. His proximity made her look up. "What do you want?" she asked in her typical neutral tone, but her eyes seemed to suspect Luke was up to something. "You see your boyfriend and don't even say hello?" Luke asked with a slight smile. Last night, he'd secured the privilege of one kiss a day, whenever he wanted. Wednesday herself had granted him that reward. He didn't have to do anything. Before, he had to gauge each gesture, analyze her expressions to see if it was appropriate to get close or if the situation allowed for a kiss. But now he had the freedom to cross that barrier at least once a day. "I just want a simple kiss," Luke added. Wednesday's eyes narrowed slightly, showing a hint of irritation. She didn't like displaying any sort of affection in public, especially with her little brother watching from a few meters away. "It's not the time," she said, hoping that would be enough to stop him. "So what? You yourself said I could kiss you once a day whenever I wanted. I didn't force you to offer that benefit. Are you not going to keep your word?" Luke asked with a slight smirk that irritated Wednesday, but at the same time appealed to her. She exhaled slowly, her expression impassive, though her eyes showed a faint but visible irritation. She didn't like being pressured into anything, but after all, she was the one who'd granted Luke the daily kiss privilege. Breaking her word would be worse than any discomfort. Finally, with a look that said, "This doesn't mean I enjoy it," she leaned toward Luke just enough for him to kiss her briefly on the lips. A short, cool kiss that Luke savored. Pugsley, who had been watching the entire scene with growing disgust, clenched his fists, his hand closed tightly near the snake's head, gripping it so hard that within seconds, the snake stopped moving. Luke noticed the gesture out of the corner of his eye but said nothing. His small revenge was complete. Normally, he might try to get along with his girlfriend's brother, but he didn't care. The three of them waited in dead silence for Morticia and Gomez to arrive. They had to wait nearly 10 minutes before they noticed a distinctive black car in the distance. Chapter 135. A difference between couples. A dark-as-night vehicle was approaching them. It was a very distinctive Gothic limousine, a 1938 Pontiac Silver Streak model, meticulously modified and extended on the sturdy chassis of a classic Mercedes-Benz G-Class. The limousine stopped a short distance from them. The first to step out was the driver, Lurch, the Addams family butler. He is tall, gangly and grim, looking a bit like Frankenstein's monster. He wore a black and grey striped blazer over a matching buttoned vest. Beneath his vest he had on a white button-down shirt with a black tie. His black pants and shoes matched the rest of his attire. "That's Lurch," Luke thought, watching the tall man open the car's rear door. It was the first time he saw him in person. From the back of the car, Gomez emerged, then tenderly helped Morticia out, taking her hand. "An extraordinary evening, Cara Maya," Gomez remarked, looking at Morticia with love. "It was, darling." Although many graves were returned to their original state, Morticia replied softly, a slight smile on her lips. The outcast police force had quite a task, putting the remains of the undead back in their respective graves. They simply threw the remains into random graves and replaced the earth. However, they couldn't manage it for more than 5,000 graves, as many zombie remains were shattered, or they couldn't find all the pieces. If by morning, all the graves appeared desecrated, it could spell trouble for Nevermore and the American Outcast Society. Could they have visited Garrett Gates' grave? Luke wondered with curiosity as he listened to the conversation. From the memories he'd read from Marilyn, or rather Laurel Gates, he knew there was a grudge involving the Gates family. Actually, there were two grudges. The Gates are descendants of Crackstone. The main grudge would be between Goody Adams and Crackstone. The second grudge is between Gomez, Morticia and Garrett. From what Luke knows from the series, Garrett is the eldest son of the Gates family and Laurel's brother. Garrett was infatuated and obsessed with Morticia during their teenage years when she attended Nevermore. At a raven, Garrett's father ordered him to prove himself worthy of the family name. To do this, he was to kill all the outcasts attending Nevermore's prom. The plan was for Garrett to take a vial of poisonous nightshade and use it to poison all the students by spiking the punch. However, Garrett didn't complete his mission, as he was distracted when he saw Morticia and Gomez leaving the dance, filled with rage and jealousy. He followed the two and began to fight with Gomez. In the struggle, Garrett managed to knock Gomez down, but in the process he dropped his sword. Morticia picked up the sword and ended up stabbing Garrett, who staggered backward and fell off the balcony, where he died. That story doesn't make much sense," thought Luke. That's what he saw and remembers thanks to his eidetic memory of the series. It was impossible for him to believe that Gomez could be defeated by a normie. It was also absurd that a normie could fight him even for a few seconds. Laurel or Marilyn was a normie with no powers. The same should be true for Garrett. Luke could kill them in a matter of seconds without them being able to do anything to stop him. Gomez, as a psychic and leader of the Addams family, one of the 6 most important psychic families, should have been able to do the same in his youth. There must be something different, thought Luke. Garrett existed in this world he knew from Marilyn's memories and public information he found, which showed that he had died years ago. He set those thoughts aside. If he had the time and nothing else to do, he might try investigating this mystery and uncovering the truth of the events in this world. Gomez and Morticia greeted everyone with their usual cheerful enthusiasm. "Come on, I'm sure you'll love our home. You'll feel right at home," Gomez said enthusiastically. Looking at Luke and Natasha, who had silently arrived a few seconds earlier, Gomez gestured for them to get into the luxurious limousine, while Lurch loaded Wednesday's luggage. "That's very kind," Natasha said respectfully, "but we'll follow closely," she added, pointing to a luxurious Audi parked on the other side of the street. "Nice car," praised Gomez, though he preferred more classic and antique cars. "At least you come with us, kid. I want to get to know the boy my little viper chose," he added with a crooked smile. "That's right, Luke. We have more than 4 hours to talk," Morticia added with a slight smile. As for Wednesday, she had already gotten into the limousine without saying a word. Uncle Luke began, then fell silent, unsure what else to say. The truth was, he didn't want to have a more than 4-hour chat with his in-laws. He noticed Wednesday was upset because he'd forced her to kiss him in front of her brother, and besides, her relationship with her mother was tense. He'd rather avoid that ride. It would be more relaxing to go in the Audi listening to music with Natasha. "Go on, Luke. Spend some time with your girlfriend and her family," Natasha said, giving him a little push. Then she waved goodbye and headed for the Audi. That thought Luke, with no choice but to get into the limousine, followed by Morticia and Gomez. Fortunately, Pugsley got into the front passenger seat next to Lurch. At least he wouldn't have to endure his hostile gaze for more than 4 hours. The seats were upholstered in blood-red leather. There were 2 rows, with room for a total of 6 people. Wednesday sat in the middle, completely still, staring straight ahead with her usual inscrutable expression. "Can you make some room for me?" Luke asked in a low tone, knowing well that his girlfriend was not in the best mood. Wednesday glanced at him sideways, then rolled her eyes with a mix of annoyance and resignation. She slid a few inches to the side, just enough for Luke to settle next to her. Morticia and Gomez sat across from them. Both were staring intently at Luke. Morticia kept a soft, enigmatic smile. She had noticed Wednesday roll her eyes when Luke spoke to her, and this piqued her curiosity. It was very difficult to provoke such a reaction from her daughter, who rarely showed emotions so openly, and this boy seemed to do it with surprising ease. "Interesting," thought Morticia to herself, her smile deepening slightly. She could have a long chat with Wednesday's boyfriend and find out, if possible, how they met. Among other things, Gomez also watched Luke with a smile, though crooked and not as enigmatic as his wife's. His eyes gleamed with curiosity as he analyzed the young man. He'd gotten to know him a little on Raven Night, but not in depth. He wanted to know more about him, to learn more about John's son, his old late friend. The journey to the Addams mansion began. The Addams residence was located in New York State, a little over 500 kilometers away. However, they didn't live in the bustling center of Manhattan, the busiest neighborhood of the city, filled with skyscrapers, traffic, and constant activity. The family had settled in Westchester County, a quieter area, removed from the urban hustle. During the long trip, both Morticia and Gomez asked Luke many questions, which he had no choice but to answer. He talked about his childhood in the orphanage, a place falling apart and gloomy, which the Addams family found fascinating. They also asked him about his 2 published novels and whether he planned to publish another book. Luke had stopped writing, or rather, plagiarizing. He'd been very busy this year and had barely had any meetings with his editor, Josh. Now he would communicate with Josh online. He didn't want to put the middle-aged man in danger. They already had a good relationship, and it would be a hassle if he died and Luke had to find another editor. "Now what really intrigues me is how did the 2 of you meet?" Gomez asked, changing the subject. Morticia looked more curious than ever. Before Luke could open his mouth, Wednesday, who had remained silent the entire trip, finally spoke. "That's none of your concern, Father," Wednesday said in a cold tone. "Don't answer their questions," she added, turning her gaze to Luke. Luke nodded slightly with an awed expression. It had been a while since he'd seen Wednesday act so cold and sharp, especially toward him. Although what he'd done earlier might have annoyed her a bit, it was more likely that the situation being on the way to her home with her parents was making her act this way. An emotional barrier she raised in Morticia and Gomez's presence. Neither Morticia nor Gomez showed any sign of anger at their daughter's attitude. With their usual calmness, they smoothly changed the topic and continued the conversation as if nothing had happened. Thankfully, the interrogation ended. From that point on, the conversation shifted to other topics, centering on the exchange between the two of them, which left Luke relieved, allowing him to look out the window and lose himself in his thoughts. At one point, an old romantic song began to play. Gomez started singing, his sparkling eyes directed exclusively at Morticia. His tone was deep, full of devotion and tenderness. Morticia, as always, reciprocated the gesture, her dark eyes filled with love, and soon she began to sing too. Her voice low and seductive. Luke, still looking out the window, furrowed his brow slightly at the scene unfolding in front of him. He turned his head and saw Gomez and Morticia exchanging affectionate glances. With each passing second, it seemed the atmosphere in the car grew more intimate between them. Gomez gently caressed Morticia's hand, while she looked at him with intense passion, as if they had transported themselves to another world. Luke felt a growing discomfort witnessing such an open and passionate display of affection, a kind of unease that increased when Gomez began to kiss Morticia fervently. Completely ignoring the presence of the two young people in the car, Wednesday, who had remained silent until then, also turned her gaze toward her parents. Her expression remained almost blank, impassive. But Luke noticed a subtle change in her face, a slight pursing of her lips and a flicker of distaste in her eyes. Seems like she's still not used to it, Luke thought with a hint of irony. If Wednesday, who had grown up with them all her life, still found those displays of affection distasteful, it made sense that he, who was just getting to know them, felt uncomfortable. Unable to resist, he sent her a mental message in a teasing tone. "Do you want me to dedicate a love song to you and kiss you so passionately?" Wednesday's expression didn't change, but she responded instantly. "I'd kill you before you could even attempt something that pathetic. They'd have to kill or torture me in the worst way imaginable for me to even consider doing something like that," Luke replied. After that brief exchange, they both went back to looking out the window. Meanwhile, as Morticia and Gomez remained wrapped up in their world of passion and love, Luke and Wednesday watched the scenery outside, without speaking, without touching, and with no need to show any affection. After several hours of travel, they finally arrived in Westchester County, New York. Chapter 136, Living with the Adams. 1. Westchester County is a county located north of New York City. It's known for being one of the wealthiest and most peaceful suburban areas in the region. It's true that the Adams are rich, thought Luke as he looked at the large luxurious houses, each with perfectly manicured gardens and entrances that hinted at the opulence inside. The limousine turned around a bend and entered a private road, surrounded by tall trees. After a few minutes, the image of previous mansions and well-kept gardens faded away. Luke finally caught sight of an imposing structure that contrasted with the elegance he had seen until now. A haunted, decaying mansion with irregular towers and a dark facade, windows in strange shapes, some partially covered by ivy or boards, and stone gargoyles perched on the ledges. He remembered the Poe mansion in Boston, but it wasn't as rundown or eerie as the Adams mansion before him. "What's wrong? Don't you like our mansion?" asked Gomez, looking at Luke, who had a frown on his face. Wednesday and Morticia looked at him as well. Luke snapped back to reality upon hearing them speak to him and stopped frowning. "It's not that. I was thinking about something else." "It's a splendid mansion. Is it haunted?" asked Luke. He had frowned upon remembering the Poe mansion, his inherited property. The Poe mansion had been uninhabited for many years because of his enemies. Going to live there would be like signing his own death sentence. All the Spellmans could attack him while he slept. A mansion that belonged to his family for who knows how many years cannot be inhabited by those bastards. That's what made him frown. "Haunted, no, but the building has been condemned 5 times. Morticia responded with pride in her tone. "Oh, that's nice," said Luke with a strange expression. Calling a building condemned means it has been declared unsafe or uninhabitable by the authorities, usually due to poor structural conditions or because it poses a danger to its occupants. As they reached the main entrance, Lurch slowed down, stopping the limousine just inches from the gate, which creaked open on its own after a few seconds, revealing a stone path. The limousine resumed its course. The road was in poor condition, with several potholes and overgrown weeds surrounding it. After a few more meters, the silhouette of the Adams mansion rose fully before them. The sound of the engine died down. Lurch had stopped the Gothic limousine a few meters from a set of stairs leading up to the mansion's main door as Luke stepped out of the vehicle. He noticed that Natasha had parked the Audi a little further back and had also gotten out. "Welcome to our humble abode," exclaimed Gomez, making a gesture toward the mansion, as if presenting it. "Nice place," Natasha said sincerely. She liked dark and Gothic places to live in. Like the orphanage where she hid Luke for several years, and the old Poe mansion. "Haha, I'm glad to hear that," Gomez said in good spirits, laughing heartily. It had been a long time since they had guests who sincerely praised their humble home. Lurch unloaded Wednesday's luggage, and Luke took care of his own. With telekinesis, it was easy to move his luggage. He wouldn't leave such a bothersome task to Natasha, who looked grateful for his gesture. Gomez led the way. He opened the main door, which was covered in vegetation and creaked heavily as it swung open. Luke entered with curious eyes, finding himself in a large dimly lit foyer. A huge chandelier hung from the ceiling. At the end of the foyer was a wide bifurcated wooden staircase leading to the second floor. The walls were lined with old portraits of men and women. They were likely the Adams family ancestors. Their eyes seemed to follow Luke and the others as they entered. What caught Luke's attention the most were the statues corroded by rust, each equipped with sharp weapons like swords, spears, and gigantic maces. Then there was a huge bear trap positioned randomly on a tile in the room. The trap was also old and worn by time. What kind of decor was this? Were they trying to get someone to lose a leg? "Oh, what you see is a werewolf trap. An old toy of Wednesday's," said Morticia, her voice soft and elegant. As she followed Luke's gaze, she smiled, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Werewolf unkt," thought Luke, frowning. "The rust on its metal is special. It has the ability to inhibit the accelerated healing of werewolves. If a wolf were to fall into the trap, it wouldn't just be caught, but the enchanted rust on its teeth would disrupt its regeneration ability for several minutes, leaving it vulnerable," Morticia explained. "Unfortunately," Wednesday added, joining the conversation, "there are no werewolves around. I never managed to catch one. The closest I got was with a hiker who wandered through the forest surrounding Westchester County on a full moon night. I set the trap and stepped back to watch." "And what happened?" asked Luke, intrigued by Wednesday's pause. He wanted to hear the entire story. "He fell into the trap. I thought he might transform at any moment, but it turned out he was just a normie," Wednesday replied with slight disappointment as she recalled that scene from her childhood. "And what happened to the man?" Natasha asked, a little curiously and a little strangely about Wednesday's way of having fun as a child. Now she understood why the rumors of the Adams' strangeness. "He lost his leg," Wednesday replied in the same monotone as before, without changing her expression. "You left him bleeding out in the middle of the forest at night?" Luke asked with a strange expression. The story was surreal. "No, I carried him here, and my grandmother reattached his leg, putting it back in its original position," Wednesday responded. "Oh, I remember that scene. Little Wednesday coming into the house in the middle of the night, carrying an unknown man with a blood-soaked leg about to fall off," Gomez said, laughing. Morticia smiled, reminiscing. "She was so adorable back then. I was surprised by her willingness to help a normie," she said with a certain pride, as she didn't share the supremacist ideals of other outcasts who saw normies as animals, better off dead. Wednesday said nothing to this comment and began to walk up the stairs. "You must be very hungry. Lurch will take you to your rooms. In 30 minutes my mother's meal will be ready. It will be a delight," Gomez said. Luke and Natasha followed Lurch, who first carried Wednesday's luggage to her room. At the first landing, the staircase split into two sections, one to the right and one to the left, each curving elegantly upwards to the higher floors. Wednesday, who was leading, turned to the right, and the others followed her down a narrow, dark hallway. Their footsteps creaked on the wooden floor. Wednesday stopped at a black wooden door. She opened it, took her luggage from Lurch's hands, and without a word, stepped inside and closed the door. "What lovely hospitality," Luke thought as he continued following Lurch. After a few steps they reached another door. Lurch extended his enormous hand and clumsily turned the knob. He looked at Luke and gave a slight gesture accompanied by a low grunt. With a small nod of thanks, Luke entered the room, handing a simple suitcase, belonging to Natasha, to Lurch, who continued guiding her silently to her own room. The room was nearly pitch dark. Thanks to his vision enhanced by clairvoyance, Luke could see, though not at full capacity. He reached out to the wall, looking for a light switch but found nothing. "Shumvunked," Luke thought with a slight grimace. "The Adams don't have electricity, and the house runs on candles, like something out of the Middle Ages." Luckily, he found a 3-candle candelabra. The the kind held by a handle. On a nearby table he spotted an old-fashioned box of matches. After a few attempts he managed to light the candles, and the flickering light dimly illuminated the room. The room was medium-sized, with a four-poster bed in the center. A large antique-looking wardrobe stood against one wall, its door slightly ajar. Luke placed his luggage near the wardrobe, in one corner. A pair of shackles and an old torture wheel hung on the wall, as if they were ordinary decorative items. Lastly, a four-legged wooden table and a chair sat in front of the window. At least he could set up his MacBook there. Who keeps these things in a guest room? Luke thought, increasingly astonished by the Addams oddities. Experiencing it firsthand and meeting them in person was much stranger than watching the series or movies. He was in love with Wednesday and shared many things in common with her, but not everything. He would never live in a house without electricity or internet, nor was he a fan of torture. Although he was now being introduced to this art by Wednesday, he walked toward one of the windows, covered by an old torn curtain. He tugged on the fabric, trying to open it to let in some light from outside, but soon realized the window was sealed. Wooden boards were nailed across the frames, blocking any possibility of opening it. Of course, Luke muttered, collapsing onto the bed, which to his surprise was quite comfortable. He just hoped no cockroaches or spiders would crawl over him while he slept. Lying on the bed, he pulled out his cell phone from one of his pockets and luckily had mobile data, meaning he had Wi-Fi access. He didn't need to worry about that since he could use his phone as a hotspot to give Wi-Fi to his laptop. After a few minutes of passing the time on his phone, someone knocked on the door. He got up and opened it, and as expected, it creaked. It was Wednesday, now dressed in her classic outfit, a black long-sleeved dress with a rounded white collar. The dress reached her knees, with a skirt that was neither too tight nor too wide. She wore opaque black tights that completely covered her legs, and closed black shoes. Her hair, as usual, was styled in two perfectly symmetrical braids that fell over her shoulders. "Why are you staring so much?" Wednesday asked, noticing that Luke wasn't looking at her face but examining her from head to toe. "I can kiss you but not look at you," Luke replied with a slight smile. "I find it unnecessary. It's not the first time you've seen me in this outfit," Wednesday answered, entirely without humor. During weekends at Nevermore, she had worn that dress on multiple occasions. "Dinner is served," she added before turning away, walking toward the dining room without bothering to say anything more. "Her social battery seems completely drained. I'd better stop trying to annoy her," Luke thought, keeping up with Wednesday so he wouldn't get lost in the enormous mansion. Chapter 137, Living with the Addams 2. Luke followed Wednesday. They went down the stairs and then entered a dimly lit hallway with only a few faint candles. They turned several times as if navigating some kind of maze, until they finally emerged into a larger room. The room was illuminated by numerous candles resting on various old time-worn furniture. In the center stood a long table covered with a dusty red tablecloth. Above the table, hanging from the ceiling, was a chandelier resembling the one in the entry hall. In one corner stood a large bear statue, measuring over 3 meters, much taller than usual. On the adjacent wall hung a large painting that immediately caught the attention of anyone entering. As it faced directly forward, the painting depicted a strange, large, almost grotesque humanoid figure holding a smaller headless being. The larger figure was devouring the smaller one with its mouth tearing off its skin. Luke recognized the painting. It was famous Cronus or Saturn, devouring his son, representing mythology. "We've been expecting you. Come on, take a seat," exclaimed Gomez, who was sitting in the chair at the head of the table. At the table sat Morticia to Gomez's left, Pugsley to his right, and beside him a short, hunched elderly woman. Her hair, a disheveled grey mess, fell in strands over her wrinkled face. However, despite her old age, her eyes held a mischievous and malevolent spark as she fixed them on Luke, eager to see the boy who had brought her beloved granddaughter, Wednesday. Without saying a word, Wednesday walked over and sat down beside her grandmother. Luke walked in, glancing at the elderly woman who was also staring at him, and sat down next to Natasha, who was at the other end, away from the strange family. The chair creaked under his weight, and then the room returned to an eerie silence. Each place setting was ready with plates, glasses and silverware. At the center of the table was a large pot that bubbled and gave off steam. Luke frowned slightly, feeling the persistent gaze of Wednesday's grandmother on him. He couldn't deny that her stare made him uncomfortable. "So, you're the famous po' boy," said the old woman, breaking the silence. Her voice was raspy but filled with curiosity. "I've heard quite a few rumors about you. You've made a name for yourself, despite your fallen family," she added, looking at him with more intensity. "Oh, I forgot to introduce you to my mother." "Luke, this is Eudora Adams," said Gomez, introducing the elderly woman. Gomez's mother, thought Luke. He had only seen 2 Adams movies, along with the Netflix series. In those movies there had been an elderly woman, but she was Morticia's mother. "Not Gomez. It's nice to meet you," Luke said curtly, glancing at Eudora for a moment before looking back down at his empty plate. With people he's just met, he tends to be quiet and somewhat reserved, even if they are his girlfriend's family. Gomez had been different. Luke saw in him a rare honesty and transparency. "Oh, we have a shy boy here. I didn't expect that, given your history," Eudora said with a raspy laugh. "I'm not shy," thought Luke. He simply didn't want to engage in a conversation filled with leading, manipulative questions. He could already tell that the old woman was the type to ask difficult, double-edged questions, aiming to make you uncomfortable and uncover secrets through seemingly simple or trivial questions. "So, Luke," Eudora continued, undeterred by Luke's silence, as if she could sense his reluctance to talk with her, "I wonder, what is your goal in being with my granddaughter?" She asked in a sweet tone, different from before, though it was clear there was venom in the question, a veiled reference to the war between the Poes and the Spellmans that had been going on for hundreds of years. Luke had expected that, at some point, one of the Adamses would bring up his feud with the Spellmans. It would be odd if they showed no concern at all, given that it meant potentially going to war with another powerful psychic family just for having him among them. Wednesday looked at her grandmother for the first time, her eyes emitting an icy aura. She didn't want anyone planting strange ideas in Luke's head. She knew he had left Enid worried for her safety, after Enid's mother blamed him for an incident that almost got her killed. She didn't want Luke to do the same thing now because of her grandmother, though Eudora wasn't doing what Enid's mother had. She was merely questioning him and testing him, so to speak. Luke didn't show anger or hurt at her comment. He no longer expected support from others regarding his family feud. With Enid's family, he'd had a glimmer of hope, but after what happened with Esther, he let go of that hope. Facing an ancient and powerful family as just 2 people brings immense pressure, and having the support of a family of outcasts would be a great relief. As for leaving Wednesday worried about her safety, he wouldn't do that either. He wouldn't repeat the same mistake he'd made in the past with Enid. Wednesday had already told him explicitly that she wasn't afraid to face the Spellmans and would help him in his fight. Their fight, she as an individual, not her family, and that was all Luke wanted and needed. Wednesday, who was about to speak up to tell her grandmother to stop meddling in her affairs, saw a faint smile forming on Luke's face and had a bad feeling. Luke looked at Eudora, his face calm but with that playful glint in his eyes that only Wednesday and Natasha could identify. He wasn't going to answer the old woman's tricky question with a deep, annoying discussion about his goals and intentions. "My goal in being with your granddaughter," Luke repeated, feigning a dramatic air. Slowly he turned to Wednesday, taking her cold hand in his, "is to win the true love of this beautiful, icy maiden," he added grandly, looking at Wednesday with passionate eyes. "His acting has improved," thought Natasha, recalling when Luke had performed in front of an interviewer, telling his school story of being bullied. Eudora was surprised by Luke's sudden change. From short, dry answers and staring at his plate, like someone shy, he'd shifted to such a performance in front of everyone. What was going on in this boy's head? Gomez, Morticia and Pugsley were also taken aback by Luke's sudden transformation. In the short time they had known him, he had never shown such an extroverted side. "Cara mia," Luke exclaimed, copying Gomez's passionate tone, while he exaggerated kissed Wednesday's pale, cold hand. "I want to marry you, start a family, and live together for all eternity," he added in a tone that was both sarcastic and somehow sincere. Wednesday grabbed a knife with her free hand and raised it calmly. "Luke," she said in her characteristically monotone voice, "I warned you I'd kill you if you ever did something this ridiculous, even if it's just a stupid act." With that, she threw the knife at him with pinpoint precision. Luke, without losing his smile, quickly tilted his head to dodge the knife, letting it pass just inches from his face and embed itself in the wall behind him. "And I said they'd have to torture me in the worst possible way for me to consider doing something like this. And here I am," Luke thought, realizing this was the only way he'd come up with to escape the conversation with the old woman. "You can kill me with love," Luke said. Wednesday pulled her hand away from Luke's gentle grip and rose from her chair. A whirl of darkness began to form in her hand, taking the shape of a dark, menacing Sith. Luke took several steps back, his smile fading from his face. "Crap, she's serious," he thought. Today, he'd exhausted all of Wednesday's patience, and this was the result, though he'd still prefer this to dining on who knows what horrid food and chatting with Eudora. Seeing Wednesday advancing with a cold expression and a dangerously sharp weapon in her hands, Luke had no choice but to start running. He ran down narrow, dark hallways, careful not to stumble over the uneven floor and steps that appeared out of nowhere, while dodging sharp bursts of darkness that Wednesday hurled at him from behind. The girl didn't seem to mind damaging the property. Leaving blade marks on the walls, he turned a corner and saw Wednesday's pale face shrouded in darkness. He had a second to duck, narrowly avoiding the scythe as it swung overhead, clipping a few strands of his hair. Shadowunk, thought Luke with a grimace. With a telekinetic wave, he pushed himself backward and resumed his escape down another hallway. He tried to open several doors, but they were all locked, and he didn't want to break the locks in someone else's house. Finally, he found a door slightly ajar. He slipped in quickly, closing it behind him with a soft click. He found himself in a dark room with a small window letting in barely any light. However, the sense of security was short-lived. In the deadly silence of the room, he heard Wednesday's footsteps approaching, followed by her whisper reaching him. "Where are you, Luke? Why are all the girls I know so violent?" Luke thought, frowning. Enid had her own way. She openly showed jealousy, and when she was mad it was frightening. Natasha was the same, displaying a chilling brutality. Veronica also had her traits. Despite being called the Princess of Umbria, she had a strong personality. As for Wednesday, she was by far the scariest when truly angry, which was hard to provoke. This was the first time he'd seen her genuinely angry with him. Usually, she tolerated his jokes and mocking comments, even playing along in her own way. Just as he was about to hide in a dusty closet, the door suddenly swung open with great force. Wednesday entered at a steady pace, holding her scythe in her left hand, her gaze fixed firmly on Luke. "Why don't you defend yourself?" Wednesday asked, pausing to look at Luke, who was just about to use shambles to escape. Luke halted the movement of his hand, about to launch shambles, and fell silent, thinking. He knew he could fight on equal footing with Wednesday, and was confident he could win. Just as Wednesday believed she could beat him. "I'll never raise my hand against you, only in training," Luke answered after a few seconds. "Always so protective of the people he cares," thought Wednesday, as the dark scythe dissipated from her hand. She had noticed this aspect of Luke's personality. He was very protective of those he cared about, and those people were few. She'd seen it with Enid, and even with that girl named Gia. She remembered how he defended her from bullies. The same was true with Natasha and his only two friends, Xavier and Ajax. During the blood moon, she noticed he seemed relieved in a way to see that the two of them weren't there. Wednesday walked slowly toward Luke. He no longer seemed cautious. Sensing that she no longer intended to attack him, she stood on tiptoe and kissed him. This kiss was much longer than the one that morning. "Don't ever do that again in front of my family. Don't kiss me in front of my brother either," Wednesday said after pulling her lips away from Luke. "I won't," Luke replied, nodding. He knew Wednesday didn't like it and didn't want to make her uncomfortable on purpose. He'd only done it for a bit of revenge on Pugsley, and just moments ago to avoid Eudora's questions. "Let's go back. I'll deal with my grandmother. I won't let her interfere and ask you uncomfortable questions," said Wednesday, taking Luke's hand and starting to walk back toward the dining room. "Fine, thanks," Luke said, a bit surprised by Wednesday's sudden concern and how quickly she'd forgiven him for earlier. "By the way, you might think that kissing in front of your brother is like a kind of torture for him. I saw his expression when we kissed. He was dying inside with rage," Luke said, walking down the dark hallway hand in hand with Wednesday. Wednesday paused for a moment. "Oh, interesting. I'd never thought about that. It might work." "A pain much worse than the physical," she said as she continued walking. By the time they reached the dining room, they were no longer holding hands, and each returned to their seat. Lunch had already started. Luke noticed Natasha's expression of disgust and understood why. In her bowl was a kind of dark, thick soup with pieces of wilted vegetables. He could swear he saw an eye floating in it. Though who knows from what animal. The meal continued without any tense or awkward conversation. The elder woman refrained from asking delicate questions, focusing only on Wednesday's school year. The two got along well, sharing a mutual appreciation for the macabre and morbid. That night, Luke, Natasha and Wednesday gathered in Luke's room to discuss their plans for reaching a higher. Chapter 138, Bittersweet Truthy. Luke was in his new room, gathered with Natasha and Wednesday. It was already night. The door was closed and the three of them were looking at a four-legged wooden table where a map was spread out. Illuminated by candlelight, between Shadesize and Sunnyvale, there's a distance of 30 kilometers, Natasha said, pointing to several spots on the map. "How do you know the evidence is hidden there?" Luke asked, his hand on his chin. Natasha looked up from the map and glanced at Luke with some hesitation, as if unsure how or whether to answer. "What is it? Why so much mystery?" Luke asked, noting Natasha's silence. "The night I separated from your parents was the night you were born. A rainy night with our enemies right on our heels. Your parents decided to split up. They went one way, and I went another with you," Natasha began. "Why didn't they give you the evidence?" Luke asked, his tone more serious than before. He knew only a few stories about his late parents. Natasha had managed to hide Luke and live in the shadows for a long time. If she had had the evidence, they wouldn't be going through such a mess, and his parents that night might as well have been fighting and not looking for a way to get the evidence to safety. Splitting into two groups reduced the risk of us all getting caught. If they were pursued by the Spellmans and ended up in a confrontation, you and I would be safe. You would be the last hope for claiming vengeance in the future. If, on the other hand, they followed our trail, your parents could escape with the evidence and continue the fight." Natasha replied. What's Luke thought? A confused expression on his face. This wasn't what he had believed about his parents. He thought they had heroically sacrificed themselves so Natasha could flee with him and save him. So, they just accepted that you and I might die? Luke murmured incredulously. That way, whichever group survived could carry on with the vengeance, Natasha added. Wednesday listened silently without making a sound. They could have drawn attention to themselves, done anything to make sure they were the ones pursued. But they decided to leave it up to chance, Luke said, a hint of pain in his voice. Ever since he learned about his past and how he nearly died as a baby, he had believed his parents sacrificed themselves so he could escape. But that wasn't the case. If only I had known with my eidetic memory. Luke thought, touching his temple and frowning. The gift of eidetic memory allowed him to recall every detail with overwhelming clarity, but at that point in his life, even that wouldn't have helped. His mind wasn't ready yet, nor had his powers awakened. Besides, a newborn has dulled senses, and their brain is still forming. Natasha looked at him, sadness in her eyes. Luke's parents hadn't sacrificed everything for him. They had made a strategic, cold, and calculated decision, based on probabilities rather than an instinct to protect their child at all costs. I guess that if I died, they could just have another child, Luke commented after a few seconds of silence, staring at the old wooden floor of the room. They wanted to make sure that if anything went wrong, at least one group would have a chance to continue the fight. Natasha said in a low voice, her tone slightly trembling. Luke said nothing for several seconds. His main motivation for avenging himself against the Spellmans was that they had killed his parents, who he thought had given their lives to protect him. Parents who, unlike in his previous life, truly loved him, or so he believed. Another reason was that he had no choice but to continue the fight, as the Spellmans would eventually come for him and try to kill him. Let's go back to the original question. How do you know the evidence was there? Luke asked, returning to his usual self, though a trace of pain was still visible in his expression. We separated at the Ohio border. I headed south with you in my arms, crossing into Kentucky. Your parents, on the other hand, went deeper into Ohio, a few hours after we split. I realized they hadn't followed my trail, so in that gamble it was the two of us who were saved, Natasha continued, pausing to take a breath before going on. Your parents, as powerful psychics, managed to hold on. They didn't die right away and managed to hide the evidence somewhere in Ohio. After hiding it, they moved away from the spot. Maybe they were trying to mislead the Spellmans, to lead them far enough away so they'd never find the hiding place. They used the lust of their mental and physical strength to protect that final secret. How do you know all that after you separated from them? Luke asked. Remember, your mother was a telepath. Her mental link had a range of about 500 kilometers, though in her weakened state it was probably less. We stayed connected for a while until the link broke and I lost contact with them, Natasha replied. So while you were in communication, they kept fleeing. They didn't have time to tell you where they hid the evidence, Luke said with a slight grimace, and Natasha nodded. And Edgar, wasn't he with them for a long time before he changed objects? Luke asked mentally. Since they arrived at the Adams mansion, Edgar hadn't left his pendant. He told Luke that in this mansion, if he came out, there was a chance he'd be discovered, and he wanted to avoid that hassle. So they stayed in contact, speaking telepathically. No, his change of object happened before the final battle. When your parents realized they were being pursued, in that situation, it was best for him to leave as soon as possible so he could guide you in the future. Even though he's a ghost only a Poe can see, that doesn't mean he's immortal or can't be harmed, Natasha responded. The Spellmans didn't suspect anything when they didn't find the evidence with them, Wednesday asked, breaking the silence for the first time. The Spellmans' goal was likely to eliminate the Poes and destroy the evidence. They must have had at least a slight suspicion that the Poes possessed something incriminating against them. They might have suspected it, or maybe not. My theory is that John and Sophie left some false evidence with them to make them think the matter was settled. Maybe they even used part of the real evidence to protect the most important pieces, Natasha replied. By that point, she was already over 500 kilometers away from Sophie, so she couldn't communicate with her anymore. In short, your parents managed to hide the evidence and make sure those bastards didn't suspect anything. No one knew Sophie was pregnant, so hiding you for many years was relatively simple. They were only looking for me, but I'm a shapeshifter, and they didn't consider it essential to eliminate me, Natasha concluded. How will we get to Ohio without the Spellmans noticing? Luke asked, resting his hand on his chin. He and Wednesday weren't shapeshifters. They had their tricks for moving undetected, Wednesday's shadow stealth, her observation hockey, their mental powers, and a few other small tricks, but it wasn't as easy as being a shapeshifter. The main issue is your fame, said Natasha, looking at Luke. She hadn't expected his fame to grow so quickly. Even simple normies could recognize him on the street, complicating things further. If he traveled to a city, someone might take his picture, and suddenly, the internet would be buzzing with where the famous writer Poe was spending his vacation. As for Wednesday, she's barely known outside of Nevermore. She doesn't have any social media, so it's much easier for her to go on a mission incognito. However, I've found a solution, Natasha added with a slight smile, looking at Luke, who suddenly had a bad feelings. What is it? A gender-switching potion, Natasha replied, and Luke's expression shifted to one of distaste. Luke already knew potions existed in this world. After all, they were part of witchcraft and wizardry, although potion making wasn't as widespread among outcasts as it was in the Harry Potter universe, where it was taught every year at Hogwarts. In this world, few people actually practiced it, and it was a little known, even taboo topic. Is it really necessary? I can get to Ohio without those bastards spotting me. I don't need to drink a gender-switching potion, Luke said, firmly opposed to the idea. In the dim lighting, he missed the faint smirk that appeared on Wednesday's face at the thought. The potion isn't for the journey to Ohio. You'd use it once we're in Ohio, since we don't know how long we might be exploring Sunnyvale and Shadesize, Natasha explained. She was confident they could reach Ohio without being followed, but once they settled in those two small towns, if Luke were recognized due to his fame, the news would quickly spread online and everywhere. I can stay in Ohio in secret, just like the Spellmans stayed in Jericho, said Luke. It'll be hard to move around, but I'm open to suggestions. If you have a better idea, we can go over it. But it's late. We have the entire vacation to come up with a solid plan. We'll talk more tomorrow, said Natasha, checking the time on an old clock. She rolled up the map and said goodbye to Luke and Wednesday. Luke walked over to his bed and collapsed onto it, staring in silence at the high ceiling. His mind wasn't on the plan to get to Ohio. Wednesday, who had barely spoken during the discussion, got up from her chair and slowly walked over to Luke's bed, sitting down near him. It's late, I want to, Luke said, adjusting his pillow and stretching out. There were plenty of times I wanted to be alone in my room at Nevermore, and you wouldn't leave, Wednesday replied, and Luke couldn't argue with that. After a few moments of silence, she spoke again. Your parents did what they had to do. It was the most logical decision. By splitting up, they ensured that at least one of the groups would survive. If they'd stayed together and gotten caught, there'd be no one left to avenge them or to fight against the Spellmans. They planned it strategically. To her, it seemed like a very logical decision. If you had been in that situation, do you think your parents would have done the same? Luke asked, turning the question back to her. The question hit Wednesday harder than she expected. The answer was clear in her mind. Her mother, Morticia, and her father, Gomez, would never have risked the possibility of her being pursued and killed by their enemies. They would have done anything to draw the enemy's attention, so she could escape and be safe. My Aunt Wednesday paused, her voice softer than usual. No, my parents would have sacrificed themselves for me without a second thought. See, in the Harry Potter scene, when Voldemort enters the house to kill him and he's just a baby, his parents sacrifice themselves. His mother stands in front of his crib and shields him from a killing curse. My mother, on the other hand, wouldn't hesitate to jump out the window if the odds were against her. Carrying me would only lower her chances of survival, Luke said with a slight, self-mocking smile. You know I haven't read Harry, Uncle Wednesday said, turning over and lying down on the bed. They both lay there looking at each other just inches apart. You should, it's a great story, Luke said, glancing at Wednesday and then looking away. He didn't feel like kissing or anything like that. Wednesday moved a little closer. With a gentle but firm motion, she wrapped her arms around Luke, pulling him toward her. She rested his head on her shoulder, almost cradling him. Luke was surprised by the sudden gesture. But he didn't move and let his head rest on Wednesday's delicate shoulder. He wasn't used to hugging her. In fact, this was the first time they'd done it. They both remained silent. Luke felt calmer and stopped dwelling on those troubling, depressing thoughts. Within a few minutes he fell asleep. Chapter 139, Sparring with Gomez. A week had passed since summer vacation began, and since Luke had been staying as a guest at the Adams mansion. Unlike his previous vacations, he hadn't left the Adams estate. He adapted to living with the strange and peculiar family faster than he had expected. He could even tolerate Wednesday's grandmother's foods, which looked like poisonous dishes cooked by a witch in her old rusty cauldron. The house was enormous. Although exploring it wasn't his primary goal, whenever he had nothing better to do, he would take a walk around. And he still hadn't explored all of it. He believed that the mansion's interior was even larger than it appeared from the outside. It was like a labyrinth, with dozens of dark hallways and staircases. Moreover, during his explorations, he could come across deadly traps left by Wednesday long ago. Or by Fester or Pugsley. Luke learned that Fester wasn't home and that it was unlikely he would get to meet him, as he was on the run from justice, not the justice of the outcasts, but normie justice. Apparently, the man enjoyed playing a cat-and-mouse game with the normie police. Or so Gomez had told him. The mansion had a large yard, where there was a cemetery with the graves of the Adams ancestors. On the second day, Morticia gave him a guided tour, telling him which ancestors were in each grave and most notably, explaining in great detail the ways they had died. The tour lasted over 2 hours. His relationships with his girlfriend's family members had started off on the right foot and developed favorably, especially with Gomez. The man was very enthusiastic and easygoing. Luke trained in fencing with him several times and was soundly defeated each time. Not even Professor Vlad, Nevermore's fencing instructor, had such mastery of the art. He tried using his observation hockey, but it was useless. He only managed to last a bit longer for him to learn and make the practice sessions useful. Gomez had to hold back, which wasn't something he was particularly good at, especially when he got excited. Luke thought Wednesday was skilled in fencing thanks to her mother, as the series showed Morticia as the captain of the fencing club, but the real master was Gomez, who taught both of them. He never liked Nevermore's style of fencing, though, because it had rules he preferred death matches with no rules. He also learned that Gomez possesses a dark aura. Luke found this out when he asked Gomez for a friendly sparring match. They had their practice fight in the mansion's large yard. This time, they used their auras instead of swords. Luke wanted to gauge how strong Elliot Spellman, Sabrina's father, might become, as he was once a rival to his own father, John. Gomez was from that same generation, give or take a few years. Both came from families of psychics among the Big Six. So they should have comparable strength. Flashback, this spot's good. There's plenty of space. Let's see what you're made of, boy, Gomez said with a twisted smile, cracking his knuckles. Luke stood across from him about 20 meters away, having put some distance between himself and the Adams mansion. Luke looked at Gomez with a strange expression. It was odd that a psychic adult with such a reputation would be cracking his knuckles and looking at him with an evil grin, like a villain from a low-budget movie. Let's see how far I am from catching up to Elliot, Luke thought. Doing a few light stretches, he trusted in his strength and his 3 auras. When he fought Atlas, he had used 2 auras, and victory became inevitable when he activated his 3rd. Against the werewolf from the Carrier clan, he hadn't even needed to use his blue aura. He shouldn't be too far off, right? When the coin hits the ground, we start, okay, Gomez said, pulling a gold coin from one of his pockets. Luke nodded, and Gomez tossed the coin into the air. Luke got into position, his eyes tracking the coin as it fell. Spinning. Meanwhile, Gomez wasn't looking at the coin, standing in a relaxed stance. As soon as the coin hit the ground, Luke shot forward from his spot. He flew at top speed, his feet just a few centimeters above the ground. Within a second, he reached Gomez. Luke focused all the telekinetic waves he could muster into his right arm, clenched his fist, and struck toward his opponent. At the same time, he sent a mental command to Gomez, telling him to stay put. With an unsettling calm, Gomez smirked as he vanished into a cloud of shadows just before Luke's fist could land. The shadows seemed to consume him, enveloping him completely and making him disappear in the blink of an eye. Luke's fist cut through the air, releasing an explosion of telekinetic waves in every direction. The ground beneath him cracked, and a gust of wind kicked up dust and dirt. Hout, Luke thought, surprised that his attack had been dodged so effortlessly. He had used his maximum speed and even issued a mental command to Gomez, yet Gomez managed to evade it. Neither Atlas nor the werewolf from the Carrier clan had been able to react to his flight-enhanced speed. Adding a mental command to stay in place would have made it nearly impossible for anyone to dodge or defend against the attack. He recognized the technique Gomez used: shadow travel, the same ability Wednesday had used many times, though she couldn't launch herself with such astonishing speed. Luke stopped analyzing as he sensed Gomez repairing behind him. Thanks to his expanded domain covering a wide area, he managed to turn in time to see Gomez raising a hand completely shrouded in darkness, so deep it seemed to absorb the light around it. Before Luke could react, he felt an overwhelming force pulling his body toward Gomez. The darkness in Gomez's hand was generating a pull like a black hole, sucking in everything nearby. The S-world around them, and the pressure grew intense. Luke sent several mental commands to Gomez, telling him to lower his hand or stop, but nothing worked. He couldn't understand why his mental commands weren't effective. Perhaps the man had protective artifacts for his mind, but typically, such artifacts add layers of protection to one's memories, not against commands from telepods. Otherwise, the mind command techniques of Blue Aura users would be easy to counter. Strong wills can't be ordered by a weaker force, Gomez said with a slight smile, guessing what Luke was thinking about his mental powers. After saying this, Gomez increased the suction power. Luke began to struggle not to be pulled in. He tried to fly backward, using all his telekinetic power to distance himself from Gomez, but it didn't work. If I can't escape the pull, I'll use it to my advantage, Luke thought. He could use shambles to escape. But he was always one to go on the offensive. In that moment, instead of resisting, he relaxed his body and allowed the force to drag him toward Gomez. Simultaneously, with precise control, he generated a telekinetic wave explosion behind him, propelling himself forward at a dizzying speed. Once again, he charged his fist with telekinetic waves, but this time his speed was enhanced by Gomez's pull, making the strike potentially more devastating given Newton's second law. His fist was drawn toward Gomez's darkened hand. Luke, expecting a powerful collision as his telekinetic waves released, was surprised nothing happened. The waves didn't dissipate into the air or explode in place as usual. Gomez's black hand absorbed the waves entirely, as if it had devoured them. There were no vibrations, no shockwaves, just silence. Your drive is admirable, but also predictable, Gomez commented with a slight amused smile. Before Luke could react, Gomez struck toward his stomach with his fist. His speed was beyond anything Luke had faced before. He barely had time to create a telekinetic barrier, which shattered on contact with Gomez's darkened fist. Gomez's fist sank into Luke's stomach, sending him flying like a human bullet. His body tore through the first tree, reducing it to splinters. But he didn't stop there. He flew several meters more until crashing into a second tree, which withstood the impact and halted his trajectory. Luke hit the ground with a dull thud, his body aching and shaken, as a metallic taste filled his mouth. Damn, thought Luke, spitting blood and feeling the sharp pain in his side. He knew that at least a couple of ribs were broken, but thanks to a telekinetic barrier he had instinctively formed on his back, the impact hadn't been as damaging. This was the worst situation he'd ever been in. Even when facing multiple or adult enemies, he'd always maintained a degree of control and emerged victorious. But now he was being overpowered, and Gomez remained relaxed, not even appearing to use his full strength. His mental commands and telekinetic waves didn't seem to have any effect. For the first time, he felt powerless. If I use Void Edge, I can win, Luke thought. Void Edge was the name he's given to the ability he used to slice Atlas cleanly in half. If that attack could perfectly cut through mythical bronze, it should be able to harm Gomez. The problem was that it required too much time to prepare. He needed at least 30 seconds of absolute concentration to condense the telekinetic waves to a critical level. His opponent wouldn't just stand still while the air around Luke's palm distorted from the waves. It was like Goku's spirit bomb Genki Dama, which required someone to buy him time to launch it. In his fight with Atlas, Luke had used his mental powers to trap him in an illusion, giving him enough time to unleash the attack. The challenge now was getting close enough to Gomez to touch his head and cast the illusion. Unlike his mental commands, illusions might work since they affect the senses. A few meters away, Gomez was calmly wiping a thin line of blood from the corner of his mouth. Absorbing Luke's telekinetic waves had come at a cost, but he was far from weakened. He observed Luke from a distance, a mix of admiration in his eyes. A true monster for his age, thought Gomez, examining Luke from a distance. Gomez had a deep understanding of prodigies. His little Storm was a genius with a fighting ability far beyond her years, Yet, if he had used the same strength against his daughter, she would be in a worse state than Luke, and wouldn't be able to inflict even the slightest damage on him, unlike Luke's telekinetic waves. With a faint smile, Gomez watched as Luke stood up despite the devastating blow he'd taken. The boy's tenacity was admirable, especially seeing how he ignored the pain of broken ribs and the blood dripping from his mouth. But what caught Gomez's attention most was the dangerous glint in Luke's eyes. As if he was already rethinking his strategy. "Let's stop here, it's just a friendly sparring match," Gomez said, approaching Luke with a relaxed posture. His tone was light, almost playful. "We're not in a death match where we throw out deadly finishing moves." Right, Gomez knew that Luke had killed a Gorgon with mythical bronze. That attack would be lethal even to him, though he was confident he could dodge it. "You're right," said Luke, giving a small embarrassed smile as he scratched his head, realizing he had been ready to launch a 100% lethal attack at his father-in-law. However, his expression quickly shifted to one of indignation. "Did Gomez say friendly sparring?" "Friendly sparring," Luke repeated in a reproachful tone, frowning. "You nearly put me in a wheelchair with that punch. Luckily, I managed to slow myself down before crashing," he added, feeling the pain begin to settle in as the adrenaline of the fight faded. "Ha ha ha, that's right, I forgot," replied Gomez, laughing heartily and scratching his head awkwardly. The fight had been so captivating that he'd barely held back his strength in that dark punch he directed at Luke. At Gomez's carefree response, Luke left his anger behind. He was then carried back toward the mansion with Gomez's help. He was treated by Eudora, who, instead of having an infirmary or anything similar, had a creepy laboratory. She gave him a potion with a disgusting taste and appearance. But it was highly effective. After only a few hours of rest, he was as good as new. End of flashback chapter 140. Training at Adam's mansion. Luke found himself in the center of an underground chamber. It had been just over a week since the beginning of the holidays. The room was rectangular and nearly dark. In each corner there was a torch with a faint fire that barely helped to see. In any case, the lighting in the room was of no use to Luke, as his eyes were covered with a black blindfold. The walls of the chamber were made of massive stone blocks, each one pierced with a series of small dark holes. It was difficult to determine exactly how many there were, but their design suggested a complex network of hidden traps. In the deathly silence of the room, Luke heard a click like some kind of mechanism activating. Suddenly, a soft yet threatening hum filled the air as a wave of arrows was shot from all directions. A normie would be dead with so many arrows, no matter how good their reflexes were. But Luke had extended his dominion, and his reflexes were superhuman. Without needing to see, his body reacted instinctively. He leaned to one side, then made a quick low spin, dodging the arrows that passed inches from his skin. Then he jumped sideways, evading several arrows. He didn't move much from his spot, but he managed to dodge all the arrows without a scratch. That was easy, Luke thought, shaking his hands. He was training in an underground room of the Adams mansion. His goal was to improve his reaction time and reflexes, as well as to ensure his body could keep up with his perception speed. He wasn't using his observation haki or pseudo-precognition, as this ability doesn't work with traps because they have no intentions or emotions. Therefore, Luke had to rely on his extrasensory ability to dodge the arrows. Luke extended his dominion, though not completely. He only covered the underground chamber. At other times, he had expanded it much further, even reaching a range of 25 kilometers. But with such a wide radius, the information became overwhelming, and it was very demanding to maintain. Detecting thousands of people, creatures, or objects at that distance generated an uncontrollable flow of data that his mind wasn't yet prepared to process fully. That's why in this type of training, he reduced the extent of his dominion to just a few meters, limiting it to the room he was in. By reducing the extent, the amount of information decreased, allowing him to focus more easily on the immediate objects or threats. The information came to his mind more clearly and concisely, enabling him to process it more quickly. Additionally, this helped him train his ability to handle the received information more effectively, instead of covering a vast territory, which gave him a panoramic view of everything happening kilometers around. He now focused on a small area and the specific movement of the arrows flying toward him. He could concentrate on detecting details like the speed of the arrows, their trajectories, and the angles from which they were fired. Round 1 finished. Round 2 will begin in 15 seconds, said a monotonous voice that echoed in the room. Luke recognized the voice. It was Wednesday. She was in charge of manipulating the traps in the walls. He focused on counting mentally, But to his surprise, after 10 seconds, arrows began to shoot out at high speeds from the holes toward him. That cheater, Luke thought as he slightly turned his head to dodge an arrow. 2 minutes later, the arrow barrage ceased. This time, Luke found it harder to dodge the arrows, which were more numerous and faster than in the previous round, but he still didn't get a scratch. "Hey, that wasn't 15 seconds, Luke complained, his voice echoing in the room. "In a life-or-death battle, you can't trust everything you hear. Round 3 starting now," Wednesday said, her voice sounding from all directions as soon as she finished speaking. A large number of arrows shot toward Luke again. The rounds continued. Each time, more arrows shot out from the holes at increasing speeds. In one round, the arrows were on fire or poisoned. Luke was no longer as relaxed as in the first round. He was already sweating and pushing himself to the limit. Several arrows even grazed him, tearing his clothes and making small cuts on him. Finally, in round 12, he had to use his telekinesis to stop several arrows. Otherwise, his brain, his leg and his left lung would have been pierced. "Game over," Wednesday said. Luke fell to the ground, exhausted, breathing heavily and feeling a burning sensation in his cuts. He had a cut on his right shin, his left forearm and both shoulders. Suddenly, one of the cobblestone walls in the right corner of the room began to tremble. Emitting a deep crack, the stone block slid to the sides, revealing a hidden opening. Wednesday calmly emerged from the passage and walked toward Luke. In one hand she carried a small first aid kit. She approached Luke without haste. When she reached his side, she knelt down and opened the kit. She took out a couple of gauze pads and an antiseptic solution, and began cleaning his wounds. Luke let out a faint grunt of complaint at the burning liquid touching his wounded skin, but he didn't complain. Wednesday continued without saying a word. She had never treated someone else's wounds, nor her own, since the times she got hurt were few, but her precision and execution were good. After disinfecting the wounds, she applied ointment to the more serious ones and covered them with bandages, finishing the treatment. From one of her pockets she took out a small bottle a few centimeters tall. Inside the bottle was a bright green liquid. "Take this, one of the arrows was poisoned," Wednesday said, extending the bottle toward Luke, who looked at it with disgust. He had already tasted that flavor. "And it was anything but pleasant. If you don't take it, get ready to use the bathroom several times tonight," she added, and Luke, with no other option, quickly took the liquid. "Am I getting better?" Luke asked after the horrible taste of the liquid faded. "Yes," Wednesday replied, not looking directly at him, as she was ensuring she tightened the last bandage she placed on him. "What did the device show?" Luke asked, intrigued. The room Wednesday emerged from was a control room that allowed manipulation of the traps and had a measuring device. Surprisingly, the Adams built this room for training, not for torture. "Your reaction times are between 50 and 55 milliseconds, Wednesday said, finally meeting his gaze. Such a time was superhuman compared to normies, who average between 200 and 250 milliseconds. A talented and trained normie, like a fighter jet pilot, has a reaction time of about 100 milliseconds. Luke is significantly superior in this regard, and all the outcasts are as well, with their bodies exceeding those of normies. However, Luke, with his clairvoyance, has an advantage in this area, though that doesn't make him the best. According to Edgar, werewolves and vampires have very good reaction times on par with or superior to clairvoyance. Additionally, the outcasts have another advantage compared to normies. Their bodies can respond almost instantaneously to stimuli. An average human has a reaction time of approximately 250 milliseconds to a visual stimulus. This time includes not only the perception of the stimulus but also the processing of information by the brain. Once the brain receives the signal, the time it takes for the body to react varies depending on the action. For example, moving a limb in response to a stimulus may take between 150 and 250 milliseconds. For more complex movements, such as jumping or aiming a weapon, the reaction time can extend even further. In total, this means that an average human could have an effective reaction time of up to 500 milliseconds for actions that require movement, considering that an average arrow can travel at speeds of between 50 and 70 meters per second. If it is 20 meters away, this implies that the time it takes for the arrow to reach the target would be approximately 80 to 130 milliseconds. Therefore, a normal human, even the most trained, would not be able to dodge an arrow. Their brain can process the information, but their body cannot react quickly enough. In contrast, Luke has a reaction time of between 50 and 55 milliseconds. This means that his brain can process the threat almost instantly, and his outcast body can start to move in about 20 or 10 milliseconds. This allows him to anticipate and dodge such arrows. Unlike normies, am I far from dodging bullets? Luke asked, looking at Wednesday, who is very good at calculating. Unlike him, a 9mm bullet can reach a speed of 350 meters per second, that equates to about 57 milliseconds from the moment it is fired to when it hits. Your brain can see and process the information about the bullet almost instantly. However, your body isn't fast enough to dodge it. Wednesday replied. Luke understood why he couldn't dodge it. His body took about 20 milliseconds to move, plus the 50 to 55 milliseconds of reaction time he had, which amounted to about 70 to 75 milliseconds. However, if he detected the killer intent of the gunman, he could dodge the shot. Nevertheless, if he used his telekinesis, he could stop the bullet or hundreds of bullets with a simple thought before they reached him, without needing any other ability. After that conversation, Luke was about to get up to leave the room, but he noticed Wednesday frozen in place. Their training was already over. Wednesday had also trained earlier, and her reaction time was incredibly good despite not having clairvoyance. What's wrong? Do you want a kissing session in this beautiful place? Luke asked with a slight teasing smile as he looked at Wednesday. The room had poor lighting, a musty smell and mold, with dozens of arrows scattered on the floor, some of them with blood belonging to Luke and Wednesday. Wednesday's face remained impassive in response to Luke's comment. She thought it was a good idea to kiss in this place, although she wouldn't call it a kissing session. I want to talk to you, Wednesday said in a serious tone, though her tone always seemed serious. Luke noticed the slight difference and, with curiosity, sat back down beside her on the cold stone floor. What's up?